Thank you. All right, welcome back from lunch. Mr. Co-Chairman, we are getting started with our agenda item number 6, which is to hear from Sheila Warren, who is the Chief Executive Officer with the Crypto Council for Innovation. Come on up, Ms. Warren. And we welcome you. We welcome the opportunity to hear from you and what you're working on at the national level. And so the floor is yours, but please take a moment to introduce yourself and your organization.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Chair Rothfuss, Chair Wester, and members of the select committee here and online. It's an honor to be here today to testify. I must say I'm grateful for the engagement leadership that you've shown on so many of the topics and the deep knowledge I know the committee already has. I look forward to sharing my thoughts on how Wyoming can continue to be at the forefront and play a leadership role in digital asset regulation, not just in Wyoming, but also now on the national stage and internationally as well. I'm here today as the CEO of the Crypto Council for Innovation. We are a global alliance of industry leaders across the digital assets and Web3 spaces. And we take an evidence-based approach to our advocacy. So our goal is to educate policymakers around the globe. We currently operate in California, New York, a number of other states, including Wyoming, Illinois, DC, obviously a big federal presence, London, Brussels, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Japan. So perspective that we bring is very international, and we're very aware of kind of where things are moving and where the kind of leverage points are in these various different opportunities around the world. We also believe that trusted partnership between government and business stakeholders is crucial to crafting regulation that benefits consumers, industry, and investors. And we're at a pivotal moment in the United States, as I know you all know, around this particular industry, where we've seen many other jurisdictions surge ahead, while the United States, certainly at the federal level, remains quite behind. Again, that's why leadership at the state level is so crucially important. Over the past 2 decades, a bit more about myself. I've held roles as an attorney, an entrepreneur. I built product. I've been a tech entrepreneur and an NGO executive. But throughout my entire career, my focus has been consistent: the intersection of technology, law, and civil liberties. I started off at a leading Wall Street law firm, Cravath, which some of you know, and I built a successful B2B software as a service product, a SaaS product, before my journey ultimately led me to Web3 and crypto. I've been in this space since 2015, full-time since 2017. And in my last role before this role at CCI, I founded the digital assets team at the World Economic Forum. And when I left there, I ran all tech policy. So I'll be focusing some remarks today around AI, but my experience goes back to 2017 when I was thinking about the intersections of various technologies, including blockchain technology and artificial intelligence. I've worked with the public sector, private sector, nonprofit sector, and the last 2 decades, I've been in global leadership roles around technology specifically. The products that I've built and supported, I think, are emblematic of what the focus is in the blockchain space is, which is to empower entrepreneurs and consumers. I wanted to make sure when I built my product, which is called NGO Source, that these folks had the tools to scale their businesses and succeed on their own terms. And it's my belief that blockchain technology is absolutely critical and a critical foundational technology to that. Now, we at CCI really appreciate the approach Wyoming's taken to advancing thoughtful, responsible, and fit for purpose. And it's a really critical, not everything's always fit for purpose, digital asset regulation, whether it's SPDs, whether it's DAOs and DUNA and all of that. The opportunities here are actually getting acknowledged on the national stage. And I also will say internationally as well. Some of the concepts that you all have pioneered here in Wyoming are really sparking conversation in other parts of the world too. Okay, so before we talk about where we're going from here and the opportunity that I see for Wyoming and for the industry, I'll take a moment just to set the scene on kind of how we got where we are. Now, in my personal view, the reason I've dedicated my career to this industry and to this space is because I believe crypto and Web3 are really a once-in-a-generation opportunity to rethink our foundational systems, whether that's financial or technical. Our current financial system, as you all know, was developed and evolved in a paper-based economy, but obviously things are continuing to move digital at an ever-accelerating pace, and we're hockey sticking when it comes to that. And that's true not just of the movement of money, but the movement and transfer of value as well. But going back to money for a moment, 41% of Americans don't use cash for purchases in a typical week. As we all know, there were 7,500 bank branches that closed in the United States between 2017 and 2021. We've been using checks since the 1800s, but now we're in a world where more frequently we are sending rent digitally, paying for coffee on our tablets, and even filing taxes online, which is a very welcome thing, I must say. It's time to focus on what might come next. But despite those stats, as I began with, the US is steadily falling behind, and in my opinion, we're failing Americans. We've been overdue for a general update to our financial rails. 69% of Americans are dissatisfied with the current financial system, and people are rapidly turning to other options when they can. Crypto can improve efficiency, it can reduce costs, as you know, and that can mean better services, better choices, and savings for the consumer. I'm sometimes asked what I think the breakout application is for the Web3 space. Where's the ChatGPT of this space? And my response is I actually think we have to think about breakout and scale and these kinds of concepts differently when it comes to blockchain technologies. Instead of building one thing to serve everyone, and there are many problems with that approach, which we're all very familiar with, particularly in the technology and data space, I believe we should be thinking about building multiple different instances of services that are designed by communities to meet their specific and sometimes even temporary needs. So I call this concept microscale and these communities micro-communities, and they can spin up and they can spin down. I know you're familiar with this around the DAOs. I believe this concept is rooted in the history of Wyoming. And it's a place that it's natural for Wyoming to lead. So I want to pivot a bit and talk about the future and specifically talk about AI. I'm pleased that I'm here before the AI session this afternoon, and I hope I'll spark some thoughts and maybe questions during that session as well. So one thing I find interesting is, and I think it's important that we think about AI and data and crypto and data privacy separately, but it's a little bit about talking about lettuce and tomatoes and sesame seed buns and and protein, right? Individually. We also have to have a view of the whole sandwich, the whole hamburger, the whole tech stack. And to me, a blockchain technology, it's a layer, it's a foundational layer. You have an identity layer, digital identity layer, you have a data layer, you have AI that's doing things with that data. And as you think about this, at AI governance specifically, I would really encourage you to consider the important role that crypto tokens and blockchains will play and are already playing in providing responsible oversight for a variety of AI applications. I'll get into some detail. To begin with, I just, again, want to applaud this committee for the forward-thinking nature of your investigation into AI governance and best practices here. The explosive growth of some of these services like ChatGPT, which I mentioned, which set records, right? Taylor Swift-like records. It reached over 100 million active users in just 2 months after its launch. This is a new era of consumer-facing AI tools and applications. We're living in it right now. And again, it's only going to accelerate. Okay, so what do we know about AI? AI is possible only due to a combination of extremely resource-intensive hardware and proprietary software. On the hardware side, NVIDIA accounts for more than 70% of AI chip sales, 70%, and holds an even bigger position when it comes to training generative AI models. The remainder of the 30% is made up mostly of big tech, Amazon, Microsoft, IBM, Intel. The extensive hardware, computational data, and capital resources needed to operate models makes the lack of accessible GPUs a huge risk factor for the current demand of AI applications. And in fact, even more than is widely known, the demand is outgrowing and outpacing the supply. On the software side, even OpenAI, despite its name, uses a closed model for ChatGPT, which not everyone realizes. And so full ownership and control of the model and even how the data it collects is trained is proprietary. I find this problematic. Decentralized compute at the heart of crypto is already helping to address structural issues that stem from AI's demand on resources and technology, particularly in this space, including by facilitating secondary markets, which, as we know, can facilitate competition. This approach allows owners of excess computing capability to sublease their capacity in real time to AI training models. That is a huge shift in how we approach and think about AI that's distinct from the capture that we're currently seeing in the market. So Web3 companies, I'll just name a couple, Jensen AI, the Render Network, are already working to solve these challenges facing AI development today by offering blockchain-based marketplace protocols that connect developers directly with solvers. By tapping into the very long tail of idle machine learning capable compute around the world, including in places here like Wyoming, and places with smaller data centers, personal gaming computers, M1 and M2 Max, eventually even smartphones. Who knows what that'll look like? Jensen estimates it can multiply the available compute power 10 to 100 times, 10 to 100x for machine learning. It's massive. So instead of a monopoly, you're actually going to be able to move meaningfully towards a free and fair marketplace for competition around this compute, rather than having the capture we talked about, which is NVIDIA, 70% of the market, and the remaining 30% primarily held by these 4 companies. Now, the resource problem I wanted to start with, because I think it's crucially important and it's something that's in very active development right now. But the most talked about contribution with crypto and connection to AI governance is its ability to improve transparency and resist censorship. And this is the thing that's getting more attention in Washington than the other compute problem, well, it's sexier to talk about, I suppose. As AI models become increasingly integrated into our daily lives, there is growing concern about the overdependence of centralized systems and issues surrounding these closed source models. And this has made the press many times over. I don't need to belabor the point with you. But efforts are already underway within the blockchain ecosystem to remedy Here's an example, right? FICO, we all know FICO, has patented a blockchain that actually tracks and audits their AI-driven scoring models. It documents model decision-making at each step on blockchains and creates permanent records of this development. So as AI and machine learning models advance cumulatively, with conclusions that these models reach informing more and more future decision-making, these interventions, are critical to ensuring that those who are building and stewarding and maintaining these models can track their progress to ensure they're advancing in an ethical and compliant and safe manner. With FICO scores informing 90% of all credit decisions in the United States, developing new means of tracking AI decision-making and model learning over time is critical to ensuring unintended consequences do not creep into decisions that could impact access to financial tools and services. Particularly, I'm concerned about this when it comes to rural areas and tribal communities. In light of the dominance and they're already dominant AI-powered applications, it's only getting more so. I'm not going to say worse because, that's a nominal, that's a judgment, but regardless, it's becoming more and more common and more frequent. It's becoming even more important to question the validity of closed source AI models and whether an output is really generated from a particular training model or data set. How do we know? What are the inputs going in? How do we track any of that? How do we ensure that we're training the models on the right data? It's very hard to know. So the crypto industry is best positioned to play a really pivotal role in creating checks and balances on AI by leveraging cryptography like zero-knowledge proofs to verify legitimacy of machine learning algorithms. So just to digress for a moment, what a ZKP, a zero-knowledge proof is, it's an advanced mathematical verification process that bolsters privacy, security, and efficiency. So it lets you confirm a data set is valid without revealing all the details of the data. And so the example I often use is, if you need to show that you're 21 years old or you for whatever reason you might want to do that, you show your driver's license and you're giving a lot of information away. But instead, if you could kind of in a binary way validate that you are 21 without showing your address, your photo, whatever it is, that would be a more safe and secure method of verification. And so that's an example that I think people kind of understand very intuitively. And for AI, you could actually use a similar methodology, a zero-knowledge proof. So you're proving something without the knowledge of the underlying data in the model to confirm that these computations, these ML computations made by other parties, meet certain requirements, right? So you could verify that they had a certain number of data or a certain, geographic disparity among the data or whatever the thing was that was important, age, demographics, whatever it is, to confirm that they meet those requirements to ensure that these models are not deceptive or malicious or even misleading, even passively misleading. So ZKPs have existed since the 1980s. And as you all know, crypto and the underlying cryptography has been around for a very long time. These have been more of an academic research area in computer science, but in recent years, particularly in this last year, the crypto asset industry has really expanded their real-world use by applying them to transaction privacy. And we're now at a moment where we're seeing the application over into the AI space. So in addition, a blockchain's open source model, which we're all familiar with, the protocol design lends itself well to building solutions to decentralized model verification. There is a company called Equity Lab pioneering AI that allows users to view and track a model's data sources, architecture, computation, and governance in real time, right? So you could actually view on chain all of these different verification modalities to ensure that they are operating in the manner that which they say they're going to. There's accountability built into the system. So Equity partnered with Accenture to test similar tools for deployment at scale across Accenture's customer base, which is hundreds of corporate clients. And they built and trained their own large language model to demonstrate how the software can actually track provenance at every step of model development and actually follow that provenance all the way through. So approaches like these, I believe, will be very critical as policymakers consider how best to combat the ongoing rise in artificial media. And we all know we're in an election season, how problematic that is, and it is potentially going to be. In the context of AI safety, content generation, AI is not only transforming content creation across culture, politics, and the economy, but also leading to an influx of AI-generated materials, including deepfakes and other sophisticated fabrications. Blockchain technology can step in to provide traceability and transparency for this kind of content, digital signatures, public timestamping of the data that's verifiable. And there are a number of solutions in development right now that are aiming to tackle content authenticity by leveraging low-cost digital provenance through the use of blockchain technology. Okay, and then kind of lastly, another topic on the topic of content moderation. There is a growing consensus from the academic community and from policymakers all around the world on the need to decentralize generative AI. And the problems with this kind of very closely held model right now. Part of the problem, of course, is that this centralization leads to control and fosters an approach to AI governance that's not really in line with competition and democratic values. The current landscape of AI is plagued by centralization, primarily because of the data inputs and the compute we talked about, the resources that are needed. And this poses significant challenges to transparency and trustworthiness. AI, by its nature, tends to centralize due to the scale effects it derives from having centralized data centers. It's not a coincidence that a lot of these big companies are monopolizing at the moment AI. It's because they have the underlying trading sets and they have the compute and they have the energy, frankly, that they to actually do all of this. And the data itself, of course, is controlled by a select few tech conglomerates through acquisitions on the things that they've done over the course of time. Similarly, it's important to note the pool of talent, the machine learning talent, is concentrated in the hands of a very small number of individuals at this moment in time. And not all these actors, it's important to note, are in the United States. In fact, increasingly, they are not in the United States, and that leads to its own challenges as the models are being developed right now that are going to basically fuel AI around the entire world. So to address these issues and foster a more transparent AI ecosystem that is more trustworthy, we believe decentralization is key. And that's a concept you're all very familiar with in the financial services arena. Decentralized technologies building off of ZKPs, like zero-knowledge machine learning, ZKML, offer potentially promising solutions. So building on the potential of ZKP and the progress made there, ZKML presents a novel approach to addressing challenges associated with data application and model integrity. Rather than having a human determine appropriate content, which is the definition of censorship, it verifies the source of the content. So you know it's not a foreign bot, an intelligence agent. You know that it is what it is supposed to be. And in some cases, that may be an AI itself, but it may also be an individual or a corporate brand or whatever it is. But you can verify the source as opposed to censoring the content. And that is a significant change in how we think about content moderation today. So as you work to identify Wyoming's role in developing AI policy, I really encourage you to be mindful of crypto's unique ability, truly unique ability to facilitate open sourcing. And maintaining Americans' data privacy will be essential, in my opinion, as you consider best practices for mitigating some of the impacts that are going to flow from automated decision-making models. Those are upon us already. Even talking to a chatbot, it is an automated decision-making model that is taking inputs and deciding and determining what should come back. But as that becomes more and more prevalent and more frequent, the concerns around data privacy, the concerns around transparency and authenticity and verifiability are only going to grow. Okay, switching gears. A lot of this is based on, of course, data privacy, digital identity. And I want to commend the Select Committee's efforts. I know you're exploring these topics as well. To be truly impactful, AI models are going to require enormous sets of data to train them. We all know this. Data that will have to be acquired legitimately, fairly, and does not violate intellectual property or privacy. One area in which the stakes are particularly high is healthcare. So I'd like to talk about this example because I think it's pretty clear to most people who've ever seen a doctor, had to get a prescription. We have started to see significant advance in medical research powered by AI modeling. Those are great. The fact that AI can crunch data from all over the place and actually figure out like what are models, where's more research needed, et cetera. But of course, patient data is among the most sensitive data that is ever generated and created. So as an example, there's a company called Patientory that's facilitating ownership of health data by patients, right? So the patient's data, but it's giving access to health data for researchers and organizations through a single blockchain-enabled platform. Patients store all their health data in a digital wallet, we're all familiar with those, and can opt in to sharing that data in medical trials while retaining ownership and rights over all of their own data. These wallets let users, through the magic of zero knowledge, share only necessary information that is needed for that particular medical trial while retaining privacy and receiving compensation for use. So this empowers users to monetize their data while providing healthcare innovators with the data that they need to advance this life-saving research and to collect and aggregate that kind of data at scale. As of 2023 in the fall, last fall, they'd already connected and aggregated data from over 24,000 health systems, and it's only increasing in their network. So an approach like this is one example among many that are being created that could help inform efforts to improve data collection, access, and security policies beyond the healthcare system. As I've noted, states will continue to play a crucial role when it comes to the development of digital asset innovation in the United States. And as you are well aware, there is currently no comprehensive federal regulatory framework for digital assets. We'll see what happens this week. You heard this morning from Chris, and I want to commend Senator Lummis for all of the work she and her team have been doing to get that federal regulation across the line and in place. Unfortunately, in the absence of that framework, we are seeing federal regulatory agencies engage in a strategy of regulation by enforcement. This approach, in our view, really fails to protect investors, particularly because the harm happens, it's after the fact enforcement. That is not what we need to be looking at. We need to be looking at proactively protecting consumers and those who use these important technologies. Blanket enforcement, what we're seeing, and kind of ad hoc sort of whack-a-mole enforcement really harms innovation. It does not allow for a thoughtful or compliant way for companies to bring to the market the products and services that are very clearly in demand. And I think you all are well aware of that. This lack of clear, consistent, transparent regulation continues to bring uncertainty across the ecosystem to all stakeholders. And it's for this reason, again, that we are so grateful for the tireless advocacy of champions in the federal government, like Senator Lummis, who've been working to kind of thwart the efforts to offshore this critical industry. As I noted at the beginning of my remarks, we are the sole major economy that does not have a national regulatory model for how to regulate this space. And so with this backdrop in particular, is even more of an opportunity for leadership, as you all know. State-based regulatory frameworks, in our view, can serve as effective and efficient regulatory models for digital assets. Speedy's great example. You led on this front, and I know that you're hearing about that tomorrow, paving the way to allow authorized institutions to hold digital assets. DARA, DUNA, stable tokens, all the things you're considering are providing important and innovative legal frameworks. And also the pressure that the states are providing is actually making the federal government take a different look. So everything happening here in Wyoming is extremely important, as you all know. Okay, so since 1977, when you all originated the first regulatory regime for LLCs, there has been commitment in Wyoming to advancing private sector ingenuity. And I'm pleased to be here today supporting those efforts, and particularly as you enter the AI space as one of the first states to take that area very, very seriously. And to me, I think, again, encouraging the holistic approach and holistic consideration of these various topics and recognizing that where speedies go, whether there's trusts, how we think about governance or through DUNAs, through DAOs, all of these things play a critical role. And ultimately that role is going to be how we land AI regulation and the underlying regulation around the data and the models that are created that are going to fuel the ways that we all interact with each other in our society. I have feelings about how rapidly we're approaching AI. Those feelings are primarily because I'm concerned about the safety and soundness of the models being created and the lack of decentralization and democratic control of any of those models. So those are my main concerns there. I'd also encourage Wyoming to reach out, as you do, to other states to think about alignment of your regulatory regime with similar requirements and standards in order to reduce the compliance burden on entrepreneurs. My primary motivation is to keep builders in the United States more than anything else. And we're seeing over time, and we can send data on this through, more and more developer talent is moving offshore. We've seen that the United States every year was dropping 2% of developers. You can actually look, there's an analysis done by Electric Capital, one of our members, that is observing on a semi-annual basis where code commits are coming from, because you have to log in, right? Your geography and where you are. Over time, the drop-off of American logged code commits is falling. It's falling at a very rapid pace. And again, those who are skilled and talented crypto developers are the future of AI development, of whatever the next technology, I don't even know what it's called yet, is going to be. Those people, their communities, their networks, the gravity and the pull that they have when they come together in community, it's not happening as much in the United States as it needs to. So there's a profound opportunity. It is a critical moment, both at the state level and the federal level of the United States. And it's crucially important that regulation at least try to keep pace with innovation. We're not doing that. So just as Wyoming's been at the frontier for American exploration and entrepreneurship for generations, I am confident it will remain so as we enter the digital future. And the Crypto Council and I stand ready. We are here. We are always available to work with you to advance all of these important issues. Thank you so much for your time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ms. Warren. Appreciate it. Questions? Go ahead, Representative Singh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ms. Warren, for being here today. This is really intriguing what you're telling us. You mentioned that America is one of the only countries that doesn't have comprehensive regulation on language models. Can you give some examples of other countries that have maybe made some mistakes, in your opinion?
It's a great question.
Ms. Warren, go ahead.
Yes, my remarks were about digital asset regulation, and yeah. But when it comes to language models, I would say we are seeing Europe that has landed the EU AI Act, which is a Frankenstein patchwork legislation. That is not that distinct necessarily from MiCA, the Markets and Crypto Assets Act, which is a comprehensive, all pan-European regulatory framework. Let me say, I commend Europe for the pace at which they got to the table. It's not easy to, as I know, as somebody who worked for Geneva Organization for some time, it's not easy to get things across the line anywhere, particularly not in Europe. However, being first doesn't always necessarily mean that it is the most, that you are able to foresee, what's coming later. I think that the mistake at this point, if I'm very blunt about it, in digital assets in the United States is not having regulation. I think there's, the education is there. I think people understand the need. I think this has gotten caught up in politics, quite frankly. And I think it's disappointing because I do look around the world and you see, I understand, like at the federal level, our agencies are more complicated. Our regulatory scheme is more complicated. So you can't compare it to the Monetary Authority of Singapore, for example, right? Which is one body, they regulate everything, they can kind of make decisions in a more efficient manner. Nevertheless, it's been years. It's been years and years now. And the reality is that companies and digital asset American consumers are falling behind in our ability to use this technology. And my concern is not even so much about the money piece of it, which is obviously very important, but familiarity with digital wallets is going to be crucial, critically important when it comes to things like AI and identity, right? So the familiarity that a lot of folks around the world have with digital wallets is something not all Americans have. Now, that being said, a significant 20% of Americans own crypto wallets, right, across the different political parties. So it is a very, very widely used technology. I don't want to misstate that. However, it really should be nearly ubiquitous, particularly among a certain generational demographic, and it's not. And the reason for that is simply because of the lack of federal regulation and the lack of an ability on the part of companies to, it's a big risk to really be marketing to American consumers without understanding and having clear rules of the road. So in my view, it isn't so much that America lacks the knowledge, it's demonstrated by, the team at Senator Lummis and other senators in Congress who deeply understand this space, and in the House as well, and folks like you all. It's a political will to say this industry needs to remain onshore. We need to be leading in this technology. We need to be at the forefront of innovation and not allowing this to pass us by in any way or kind of sidestepping it. So in terms of mistakes, I do think that sometimes the regulations are overly focused on just financial services. And the reality is this is a foundational technology. I talked about AI today on purpose because I wanted to make it very clear that we're at a pivotal kind of inflection point, if you will, around this technology and its use. And I think we're going to see tremendous uses around everything I talked about today. They're going to start to emerge in other parts of the world and not here simply because we've sort of, the horse is out of the barn everywhere else and not here. So that's why I have the concerns that I have and why I chose to address that particular topic today. But thank you for the question.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Warren. Any follow-up, Representative Singh? Go ahead. Okay, good. Other questions? Mr. Co-Chairman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. Ms. Warren, I really appreciate you coming all this way to share some of your thoughts. I want to make sure I heard you correctly. You mentioned that how there are developers out there who are using the decentralized blockchain model to verify the training data that some of these
That's right.
that these LLMs are using. Now you're saying that's a conceptual idea, or that's something that is happening right now?
It's in production today. It's not happening at scale, but it is at the forefront and starting to be used more and more. And so we are starting to see some inroads into competition against these massive language learning models. And the competitive advantage, of course, is that there is traceability and verification of the inputs that are going in. So we'll see what the market thinks about that. But in my view, the dominance by historically large tech players in this space is highly problematic for competitive reasons, but also just for control and transparency reasons as well, safety.
Mr. Co-Chairman, go ahead.
Mr. Co-Chairman, thank you very much. I appreciate that. From a regulatory perspective, because we talk a lot about things in a conceptual sense, but at the end of the day, we got to put something on paper that we can sell to our colleagues and get the governor to sign it and put it into law. That said, what are your thoughts on at a conceptual level of legislation that's kind of saying, hey, if you want to serve customers in the state of Wyoming, you need to make sure that your LLMs are serving customers, that the data that your LLM use is through these kind of certified ideas. Because what I said correctly is it's the idea of basically just it's at a simple level, it's a new type of data auditing software or data software methodology, however you want to call it. But with legislation like that, do you think that could help move the needle forward, or that inhibit folks?
Ms. Warren, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, again, what I think the goal it should be is to try to empower builders in this space who are building in a highly competitive market. And it's very, very difficult for them to have entrance to the market. And so I do think that's kind of thing with level playing field, because it would kind of force some of the big players to prove and to audit and different. And I think you'd have some options, right? But I do think the concept of data auditing and particularly when it comes to verification of the source of the data is really important. And no one is being bound to that right now, because they're using data that's come in through, for a decade at this point with some of these big companies without any sort of demonstration or audit around what it is. Some of them are choosing to make some of that transparent, but there's no standardization around it. There's no proof that it really is the case. So conceptually, I actually would support something like that because I think it would promote competition, which I think is really important. And at this particular moment, I think forcing a pivot in sort of the approach to data auditability would actually be quite powerful, in my opinion.
Mr. Co-Chairman, follow.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. Gosh. It almost kind of reminds me of, once upon a time, there were no standards around fuel and fuel usage and unleaded fuel. And, we got 87, you got 91 and av fuel and all that stuff. So it's almost the same kind of thing about what kind of data are you putting into your vehicle, right? Into your LLMs.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna, Mr. Co-Chairman, I'm gonna chew on that a little bit more, but thank you very much.
Absolutely. I'll just say it's the garbage in, garbage out phenomenon at scale.
Yeah.
Right.
Additional questions? So, one of our guiding principles is the idea that we're going to regulate to enable technologies rather than regulate to restrict. We really focus on that and recognize the need for consumer protection, good practices, getting stakeholder input, transparency, all the things that have been discussed to get to that point where people can operate well. One of the challenges we have is always thinking through Wyoming is a small enough state that you could have entities that basically just pull out of Wyoming rather than complying with Wyoming statute. So we're thoughtful about that as well. The state of California can just implement almost whatever they want, and everyone has to comply because at the end of the day, that's too big of a market. Wyoming doesn't have that luxury, but that probably keeps us in a good place also to be thoughtful about it. So from that context, as we're contemplating what the co-chairman was talking about, how can we provide some thoughtful regulatory structure that is beneficial, protects the public, and at the same time doesn't scare industry away where they decide, all right, well, we'd rather just operate in 49 states than 50 because we don't like that particular provision. Do you have any thoughts on what that might look like? What could we do? What change could we affect that would help to move down this path that you're discussing and get away with it, so to speak?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. And this is where I come back to kind of my hamburger, metaphor, right? Because Wyoming's already seen as cutting edge when it comes to crypto. Like, you're already seen as a state that is attractive to crypto companies and crypto builders. And I think leaning into the fact that AI and crypto aren't as separate as people are talking about, they're actually models. And there are some protocols, Near.ai as an example, that have completely rebranded themselves around pivoting to AI use cases and models. And so I think that leaning into the crypto side of it would actually help attract AI companies to the state by saying, we understand this space really well. We understand that there are ways of basically securing the foundation of the data and the foundational decentralization and the governance, all of these different things I talked about today in the use of AI. I think you're going to see more and more of that connection happening because, again, this technology exists. It's out there. It is at scale. It is robust. And folks are kind of realizing like, wow, like consumers aren't really trusting models. They're not going to trust models. They don't know what's going into them. There's concern about that, right? There's concern about ChatGPT. People are very targeted in their uses of it, as an example, and what they're willing to do with it because they don't really know what's going in, and you really need to understand that. So I actually think that branding it, if you will, if you want to think of it in those kinds of terms, as the crypto-friendly AI is going to be a hook to pull AI companies here. And once AI companies are here, then you kind of grow it that way. Because the reality, to your point, Chair Rothfuss, is that a lot of these companies are already, the big tech, the ones we talked about, they're in Washington State and California, right, and some in New York. That's where they are now. And so their competitors are either going to be there competing for the same pool of talent or trying to be in different places using models that are actually adjacent. They're not different. I mean, AI is AI, but the inputs in the model and all of that is what is different. So I think leaning into the brand, that you already have around being very crypto knowledgeable, crypto friendly is one thing, right? But crypto knowledgeable and understanding what the technology can do would actually be quite a hook.
Go ahead, Representative Singh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Warren, you said that AI is AI. Can you talk a little bit about that? What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So yes, yeah. So I think when I say AI is AI, it is not a human, right? It is artificial intelligence. And so at the end of the day, you're not substituting human inputs for the artificialness of the artificial intelligence. Where they differ and where AI is, so I meant that conceptually, but where they differ is the quality of the AI. Right. So how intelligent it's all A, but how intelligent? The intelligence has a dramatic spectrum. And in some cases, if you put garbage data into it or irrelevant data, or you put a certain kind of data, you're going to get outputs out that aren't actually very intelligent at all. It can be artificial stupidity, if you will. But the artificialness of it is, I think, what is consistent from AI to AI. So that's what I meant by that statement.
Follow up, Representative?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I guess I'm just confused on how we would be able to decentralize AI if there are various different types of models that they can operate on.
Yeah. So I guess the question is, which model do we think is preferred as a society? And that is a value judgment. And so in my opinion, a decentralized model that is decentralized in its governance, that has verification and verifiability and transparency of the inputs and traceability of those inputs, to me, that is a preferred model to a model that as a consumer, I have no visibility to what went into it. For all I know, one person just sat there tracking everything about themselves, and suddenly that's becoming the model for, everything, right? Now, that being said, actually, an interesting point there, I'll digress for a moment. I do think we're moving to a world where there are going to be AI agents. So I'm going to interact online with an AI agent. That AI agent is going to be trained on me. And in that case, like the meanest of me is going to be the only relevant input that goes into that. But you're still going to want to know that I, through a digital identity layer, right, verified on a blockchain, am the person that created that data, so that agent is a representation of what I am going to do in my patterns of behavior and whatnot online. Even in that case, where it's a single source, literally, like it's an AI agent that's like Sheila Warren or whatever, right? Like even in the case where that the inputs come from one source, and it's not hard for me to like, yeah, you still want to have that verification online, because I'm not moving around online. I'm not, the human's not doing it. The AI is doing that. And you want that validity that it is me. And what can do that better than anything else? A blockchain, right? A token model that demonstrates that I am the me that I'm saying that I am, and the AI is representing me. So even in that mono case, if you will, it still makes sense to have an underlying technology that's decentralized, verifiable, transparent, traceable, all the things that we know blockchains are.
Thank you, Representative Singh. Follow up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That answered my question.
Great. One thing that I think is critical that you're raising is the provenance aspect of it,
Yeah.
and understanding the source of the data. When we see, from a governance standpoint, a lot of consternation about, you're using my data, I'm going to sue you, that violated my copyright, because it is very Wild West at this point, and there's no mechanism in place to say, yeah, I did use your copyrighted material, and now I'm going to compensate you for it, the training model, because that's represented, yes or no. And obviously there's no requirement at this point. And honestly, there's also really no clarity of fair use.
That's true.
From the standpoint of, well, I trained my model on it, it read your book. Is that fair use or not, that it read your book, or read your articles online that are publicly available and trained off of those? And that could be something that we could contemplate, but once again, I don't know whether this is something that we have the hooks to get into as a state. Copyright ends up being so deeply tied to federal law. I'm not so sure we could dig into that. Do you see anything with the provenance side that a state could act on that would sufficiently be binding such that it would achieve objectives?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, just the way that YouTube really forced us to think differently about the DMCA, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, back in the day, right? I think we're going to see the same thing with AI provenance, right? And so it's a great question about whether that necessarily must be a federal interrogation, or whether at the state level. Now, I do think, look, first of all, it's got to start somewhere. And I do think, to your point, it goes the other way too, right? So just as if you can't prove what went into an AI model, you can't prove what didn't go into an AI model. And that's also really important. And I do think those kinds of protections are critical. And I think when you think about creators, right, and you think about individual entrepreneurs and the rights that they have to their own creations, which is something we kind of hold sacrosanct and I think it's American value. I think it has to start somewhere. And I very bluntly, I do not see necessarily a lot of movement on this at the federal level. I think it's early. And I commend you all for being so early in the conversation. But in my mind, and I'm not an expert in copyright law, but nevertheless, I would think that there would be the protection of the creator, protection of their rights is something I do think could be enshrined in state law, whether it has a specific copyright frame or it has more of a protection around use of data in a different kind of frame. I think could be interesting. To your point about fair use, I do think we're still wrestling with what fair use means, and there was all of this. As things exit the copyright domain and become, public domain, there's a question around, can you do literally anything with them, or can you misrepresent them? All those kinds of things are becoming quite interesting. And you're seeing different estates and other kinds of folks say, well, this is the slicing and dicing of this thing is in violation of certain, it's not a copyright issue or a fair use issue. It's more like this is sort of denigrating the brand. It's that kind of stuff that's coming up more now, right? Which is, people are interesting in what they choose to do with things that go to the public domain, and it's a fascinating world. But regardless, I think those kinds of questions I think are going to become even more interesting. Like, is there a defamation of a character? Is an interesting, I saw a lawsuit about that, which I thought was fascinating. Go by, I don't know, right? If you're defaming, I don't know, whoever it is, Popeye or whatever, whoever's coming, is that what's that mean online when you have like an avatar or a character or something that's been online that may or may not be owned by a company, may or might not be a part of their brand? Can you engage in those kinds of questions and queries that are distinct from copyright and fair use but are related? So I would say it's a good question. I will certainly think about it and bring back thoughts and consult colleagues of mine who are more familiar and experts in the copyright domain.
Well, one area that we have talked about is we do have control over property and personal property and intangible property. And so we've worked a lot in that space because we control that space. Yeah. So granting rights to Wyoming citizens along name, image, likeness concepts as part of digital identity, reputation can be part of digital identity. And we've had conversation about treating that as property, but also treating it as still a privacy right, integrating those two concepts. We'll talk more about that when we talk about privacy tomorrow, those concepts. That is a place that we could act, and then in granting those rights, there would have to be potentially consideration to, all right, well, if I'm using images of you, I have to license that image from you. There's a royalty required for me to use that. Something along those lines could get us towards that, protecting Wyoming citizens and then not be in a space where we can't act. Do you have any thoughts on that type of approach where we're providing rights to our citizens and then those have to be respected by models?
I think that the best way to secure those rights would be something like a blockchain. You could use a smart contract to basically say, here's the flow of funds. You could put things around right of first refusal. You could put things around compensation as default, a certain standard for compensation, and say you could opt out of that if you so chose. And like the health data, you might say like, I'm totally fine with my health information being used by a medical researcher for these purposes, but I'm not okay with that being used by a cosmetics company to market a new, I don't know, whatever to me, like makeup to me or whatever it is, right? So you could make choices about the same data and who it's used for and for what. And similarly with your likeness, with content you've generated, with whatever it looks like, with your avatar, there's a whole interesting question around, like, is an avatar a person? What are the personhood rights there? How do you think about copyright in those spaces? If that online, thing that is it owned by you? Is it owned by the platform? It's very complicated. So all of these things, I think, get cleaner when you have the foundation of a blockchain-based, crypto-based token economy underlying them and a system underlying them, because you can track the ownership in a more delineated specific way, as opposed to, well, it's kind of on X or it's on Instagram, and so who really owns that? I don't really know. Is it them? Is it you? Is it this? And unless Instagram, for example, has created essentially a contract with the creator where they have kind of rules around what governs that, which are not very favorable to the creator, you're kind of in a situation where that's the contract governing it as opposed to principles of law or equity.
Exactly. Did you read the terms of use?
Yeah,
Go
exactly
ahead,
right,
Representative.
exactly. And if you didn't, why didn't you?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ms. Warren, I'm going to use an extreme example here. So, and I'm thinking about the permanent nature of the blockchain. So let's say through extreme circumstances that your name to the identity ended up being something absurd, like not sure. How would you be able, and it was put into effect and put into the system as just like a bureaucratic mistake,
Mhm.
would you be able to go back and fix that if it were on a blockchain?
Yeah.
Ms. Warren.
Thank you. So it's a great question about blockchains. And so blockchains are immutable, but they are also correctable because you can change the record as you move down the chain. So the fact that that was recorded cannot be taken away and cannot be deleted, right? But you can then log that, oh, hey, we're going in and we're going to say that now the ownership of that thing, we are making a different designation, and that is all tracked. So you would have the mistake recorded, but you'd have the correction recorded as well. And you'd see all of that on chain, right? So that's I think people sometimes misunderstand the idea that like you can't, because you can't delete something, it's there forever and in the state that it's in forever, but you can amend or append as well. And so that's the distinction I think is important in the example I think you're raising.
Representative Singh, any follow-up on that? All right. Further discussion, Mr. Co-Chairman, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. Ms. Warren, I know you got some experience in the litigation space, and so maybe I'm hoping you can answer this question. In just regarding to data provenance and that kind of stuff and what you use to train some of these models and how that could interact here. I mean, right now, if I am taking data from, just sweeping it across the web and I'm putting it into, OpenAI, just to use a name right now, if that is pulling data and they can prove it's pulling data from, say, a private source of information, how would that get handled in the courts? Would they go and say, hey, this data they use is copyrighted, it's whatever, some kind of proprietary data? And does it go through kind of just the normal modes that we have on the books for dealing with these types of disputes, or how does that work? Are there any cases where this is being litigated currently?
Yeah, I think it is
Ms. Warren, go ahead.
unclear. Thank you. I think it's quite unclear how it would be litigated. I know of cases that are starting to bubble up around this kind of thing. They're primarily in the copyright domain. Like, was that really public? Did you have the ability to use it? Is it fair use? I think it's a very unsettled area of law. I think eventually you're going to have rules around it, or the courts are going to make some decisions. I think you'd probably have circuit clash, to be perfectly frank. I could see this kind of rising up to SCOTUS eventually, because I do think that these are very contentious topics, and there's definitely not circuit agreement as a general matter on kind of where fair use, the boundaries of it begin and end. But those are the only cases I'm familiar with. Again, I'm not a copyright expert who tracks that area very, very closely, and that's where most of this is emerging at the moment. But the question really, I think, is, what's the right thing to do, right? Like, I think there is a better and worse way to think about provenance and to think about things like, fair use and how we're going to blow that concept up and have a different term for it. I think it might be legitimate use. There might be some other concept that I think is going to be more relevant, particularly if there is a verification system underlying it, right? And again, I think the point is back to, can you prove that you used something or didn't use something? So there is one case that I'll have to find and look up that went by my transom that was about, you could only possibly have gotten that outcome if you actually lifted my book. And we didn't lift your book. Well, how do you prove it? Like, how do you prove it? And so the auditability was controlled by a centralized actor, and they can kind of edit the records. I mean, they have the technical ability to do that. They may not have, right? But there's no standard around proving that you didn't do it. And if the outcome that comes out of something looks a lot like someone's book they wrote or whatever, how do you prove that that's not what happened? So I think you're going to see, I think it is inevitable that blockchains wind up being the underlying basis for AI. I just think it's inevitable because I think it is such an elegant solution that already exists in production to these challenges and problems. And once you can prove something went in or didn't, then at least you have a basis for an evidence-based finding around what the answer should be and what the rules could be around it. But right now, the dispute is you can't even prove it. You don't even know. So it's very difficult to do any kind of fact finding or investigation around it when there's just he said, or she, the company said around these kinds of inputs.
And one area we're going to talk a little bit more about later, though, is the idea of, overseeing how states like the state of Wyoming engages in artificial intelligence. This is a space where we can make decisions about what we what standards we hold in AI that the state of Wyoming would engage with too. And that gets at the possibility of that, where we could start having some influence by just saying you have to have provenance established into it. You have to show a path to non-bias, something along those lines, right? We could set standards for what we would let inform the state of Wyoming through AI. And I think we'll talk more about that so we can get back into that conversation. Further questions for Ms. Warren at this time? And I think clearly you'll be back for the AI discussion as well.
Yes.
Any other questions? Anyone online? Let me just double check. Seeing none. Okay. Thank you very much. We
Thank
really
you.
appreciate your
Thank you so
testimony and look
much.
forward to further discussions. And before we move to our next topic, this is an opportunity again for public comments, as we do with all topics, but we're going to be discussing AI more extensively at our 2:30, which will probably be more like 2:45 topic. So would anyone like to provide public testimony on Ms. Warren's testimony? Recognizing we'll have another opportunity. Anyone in the room? Seeing none. Anyone online? Seeing none. All right, public testimony is closed. We are up to our 2 o'clock agenda item at only 2:26. Review of select committee on blockchain enabling legislation. And this is something that we've discussed bringing and kind of working through, and Representative Yin is interested in working in this space. So Representative Yin, if you want to kind of give an overview of what we're looking at here.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And so I just want to provide context. I think with the history of the blockchain the select committee, it started as a task force first and then became a select committee after the task force was doing great work and really just creating a niche for Wyoming in a space that not a lot of areas had created niche for. And so in the years in between the creation of the select committee and now, we've created an ecosystem that it has grown up, frankly. And I think Wyoming has done a really good job with that. And so my purpose of bringing the topic forward is to make the thing that has made this committee really great, which is a focus not on partisan issues, but on issues of how we make Wyoming better by creating structures that incentivize business and creating regulation that makes businesses want to move to Wyoming, not scared to move away from or scared away from Wyoming, I think is really important. And so the point of the topic is to see if we can morph the blockchain subcommittee into select committee into something more broad, still very technology focused. So whether we talk about, just as we are talking about now, AI or digital privacy or anything else, while we still can talk about blockchain, and I think it will be important for us in the future to still have this select committee be that home committee for blockchain topics, be able to have the purview among our other committees during the interim to tackle more digital technology focus. So we become that home for anything that is technology focused. And I think that would be really good, especially when it comes to topics like self-driving cars or AI or any other up-and-coming digital technology focus that requires a lot of expertise and a lot of knowledge. And then we could be that home committee for that. So I had a draft bill drafted up for the last budget session. I didn't end up introducing it. It was one that turned the select committee on blockchain finance and digital technology into one of a select committee on digital technology, but still keeping that blockchain in the statute and in that focus in the select committee, and also getting rid of the restriction. So when we had the enabling legislation for the select committee, we had this restriction put on by a colleague who was the chairman of Minerals at the time, who didn't want any banking changes, any banking bills coming out of the select committee without going through Minerals in the interim first. While we've still had that restriction, we've sort of kind of done away with it just by individually sponsoring bills as all the members of the committee ourselves just to get around that restriction. But so in essence, it has become kind of moot. And so I would also seek to have that removed from the statute as well, that restriction. That seems unnecessary at this point.
Great, thank you, Leader Yin. So I'll just note before we go to kind of questions and discussion, and this is just a good opportunity for us to talk through the select committee's mission. If you look at the materials and handouts, and if you're following along at home, we're on item 7-01, which you see is review of select committee on blockchain enabling legislation, and that provides then a link to the enabling legislation under Wyoming Statute 2811-701. So if you want to see how it's currently structured for our mission, it's there. And it also talks about how the select committee is comprised. But some of the key points, when we built the select committee, the official name of the select committee, even though we call it the Blockchain Select Committee, is the Select Committee on Blockchain, Financial Technology, and Digital Innovation Technology, which is an awful lot to say. And that is why we call it the Blockchain Select Committee. I cannot. In fact, I seldom even get the words in the right order when I'm asked. So that is a bit of a challenge. And then we do have the mission of the select committee, which, as noted, we have currently developed knowledge and expertise among its members regarding issues pertaining to blockchain, financial technology, and digital innovation technology. And then as our next task, develop and introduce legislation as necessary to promote blockchain, financial technology, and digital innovation in Wyoming, unless the legislation relates to Title 13, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which goes to the Minerals Committee. And that has effectively held us back, and I don't think that interest exists anymore, so tweaking that could be something for us to consider. But it is pretty broad purview at this point. I guess one other question as we discuss this expansion, redirection, artificial intelligence probably still falls into our category as a digital innovation technology. There may be technologies, advanced emerging technologies that don't fall into digital technology or digital innovation technology that should have a home in the Wyoming legislature, and there isn't necessarily a committee for them. So that's another possibility. But I guess I'd just open it up to discussion by the select committee to see what we want to do here. We don't have to make any final decisions. We can certainly take as an action just getting a bill drafted for us to consider at the next select committee and think about it and take public testimony. But this is still a good time to just open it up for discussion and see if anybody has any ideas on what else we might want to be doing, how we could restructure it. And so anyone want to start? Go ahead, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. Representative Yoon, Mr. Minority Floor Leader Yen, what name did you have in mind as an alternative?
Leader Yin.
Mr. Chairman, I think that what I had desired in my bill draft request that Mr. Hopkinson helped me with was actually just select committee on digital technology. So keep it very simple. Really have that focus on digital technology. So we're not talking about like agricultural technology. And just have that simple name that everyone understands.
The first thing that came to me on that, I'll just note, was that quantum computing is not a digital technology, and it would still be something that this task force would want to do. So that's the problem with names, is you name yourself and then you've immediately excluded something you should definitely be talking about. And I don't know which committee would be dealing with quantum computing other than this one.
Nothing.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, it's all right. It is the challenge, right? Other thoughts? Go ahead, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. Representative Yoon, maybe just elaborate. I mean, I think certainly it'd be easier if we shrink it down to that and saying in for our poor LSO staff and all their notices. I guess my concern is that there could be a perception issue amongst our colleagues in terms of the stuff that does get referred to us. And I would just hope that we can continue to have the wide purview that we do. Because I think that it's been really awesome for the committee to be able to take up all these, really different but innovative topics. So that is just, I guess that's my current thought right now.
Anyone else have any ideas? Senator Ellis, you're reaching for the mic. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A few years ago, when I was a new legislator, I remember looking at committee assignments for standing committees, and I always thought it was unfortunate that we didn't have more of a dedicated workforce committee that looked at maybe labor issues, lighten the load of labor, lighten the load of minerals. And so I remember writing this lovely letter to Management Council asking them to look at it, and I remember it being so poorly received. And so that's where I kind of am like, well, if it's not broke, maybe we don't need to fix it. But I'm just, that was my experience, and it was not a positive one. So.
Thank you, Senator Ellis. Any other thoughts at this time? And I do think there's, no reason for us not to get it drafted. Go ahead, Representative Yan.
Mr. Chairman, I understand the desire of keeping it the same, and then we can still do the things that we do anyways, because that's what we are doing. I think ultimately my worry is that I don't want our colleagues in the future to think that we don't need the blockchain committee at all. And I think having that broader focus gets more buy-in from other members of the legislature that, yes, it does make sense that a committee has a high expertise focus on this high technology sort of topics. I think at the very least, it makes sense for us to remove that restriction. Did we did do that, or we didn't do that?
No, we haven't
Yeah,
yet.
so I think at the very least, having a draft that removes that minerals restriction would be worthwhile.
Agreed. Mr. Rebel?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. How about, Mr. Dean, emerging technology as opposed to digital? It's a little less limiting and would perhaps capture some other sectors that might not be implicit in digital technology.
Yeah, blockchain and emerging technology would certainly be a lot shorter and would cover.
I don't even know if you need blockchain.
We wouldn't need it. The one question I would have is, I think we've created a brand a little bit on that, and I wouldn't want to lose connection with the brand. Not that it's emerging technology would encompass blockchain, but I'm afraid we would lose some people. Other thoughts? Online, let's kind of run around and just get some preliminary thoughts. Mr. Kaufman.
And Mr. Chairman, I mean, my only thought is I've been involved with this committee from the outset, and everyone knows it as the blockchain committee, everyone. And whenever we testify, we refer to as the blockchain committee. So I, like many of you, am a little hesitant to drop that title because I think, I don't know, we might be starting over with explanation, but I like the suggestion of emerging technology. I think that's very appropriate and probably fits with a lot of industry descriptions as well.
Thank you, Mr. Kaufman. Mr. Pope, any thoughts? You've been on this since the beginning, since task force days.
I think there's a value to keeping things fresh and to refreshing things and making sure that we are keeping up with those emerging technologies that we're talking about. And I would have no issues with somewhat refreshing the statute as well. I do think we keep the name blockchain though, because that is the brand, I think.
Thank you. Representative Andrew, any thoughts?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also like emerging technologies, whether that's added onto blockchain or if it's just the name of the committee. I think that's a good way to go.
Excellent, thank you. Representative Yan, or Singh, excuse me, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple of thoughts. So would the scope of this select committee then be regulating emerging technologies, and then also implementing these emerging technologies as applicable in the government? So multiple missions for the select committee. And then also, I guess a problem I could see coming from emerging technologies is, well, what if we discover cold fusion? What if we get cold fusion here in Wyoming? Would that then go to this committee?
I hope so. Where else would we send it, right? Thank you, Representative Singh. And I think that is kind of the concept is trying to look at how broad that should be. And you're right, there are certainly technologies that go to other committees. You look back at when we did address self-driving vehicles and looked at how to manage a lot of the regulation around self-driving vehicles. We developed legislation on this committee, and then in working with the process, we sent it over to the Transportation Committee, and then they Christmas treed it up, and the bill died. But the bill that we drafted was a very good bill. We're not responsible for the actions of the Transportation Committee. So we again tried to work within that process, and I think that was an appropriate way to go about it. So perhaps similar types of things where we would and always have coordinated with committees that are relevant committees to technologies that we're working on. A lot of our work has related to Corporations Committee, and so we've ended up engaging heavily with the Corporations Committee folks along the way. And I think that would probably be continued if we ended up going to a broader category of emerging technologies. Go ahead, Senator Ellison.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a word of caution. I don't want to work on emerging technologies in gaming.
Duly noted and not surprised. Yep, Representative Yen.
So, Mr. Chairman, maybe may I make a suggestion for a bill draft? One where we would rename the committee to blockchain and emerging technologies. So we still lead with blockchain because that's what we are doing. We're leading with blockchain. We removed the minerals restriction, the minerals committee restriction, and then we brought in the scope a little bit. So what I had in my original bill draft, it was we promote Wyoming's continued leadership in the digital economy. So we could say emerging technology economy by reducing impediments to economic opportunities for technology and technology companies within the state. So that means making it easier for companies to get here, developing policies that encourage technology companies to locate and remain in the state. So these are things that we have been doing in the blockchain committee, and promoting further development of digital commercial activity in the state. So probably would reword that a little bit to talk about commercial activity with regards to emerging technology in the state. So all things that we're not talking about hamstringing businesses. Everything that we want to talk about in this committee is how do we bring businesses to Wyoming?
That sounds great. Is everyone comfortable with that? I don't think we need a motion unless there's an objection. I'll just say that without objection, we'll head down that path and have legislation drafted consistent with the name of the select committee being blockchain and emerging technology, or emerging technologies. Emerging technologies. I'm not quite sure which one that yeah, emerging technologies is what I would say. So let's go with that. And then making the changes consistent with Representative Yin's bill draft from last session, but with some adjustments as necessary to reflect that name change. And then we'll take a look at that legislation at our next meeting, that draft. All right. I guess we could, we should take public comment. We just took action without public comment, but any brief public comment on this before we go on to the next topic, back to AI? Any in the room? Seeing none. Any online? Yep. Oh, great. Okay. Let's get Scott. All right, Scott, we can see you. Welcome. Please introduce yourself to the committee, and the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Scott Meyer on behalf of the Wyoming Bankers Association. I will say that it's interesting to have that name change and maybe go through and refresh that legislation that appoints with a select committee, but I would be hesitant to take anything out that requires any of the oversight from the Minerals Committee. There was an exact reason for us doing that. And that's because even though you might have emerging technologies or anything else that goes with that, certainly there are interplays within the banking, within the Division of Banking and the banking statutes as they are. So to be able to just ignore that, just like I think, Mr. Chairman, you said you work closely with transportation or you work closely with corporations, I think that the same needs to be said to work closely with the Minerals Committee, because I think that's where all the banking statutes, all of Title 13 is there, and they're the ones that handle that stuff. And I'd hate to see something run through that somebody said, oh, I didn't realize that really affected the banking, whether it's converting a bank from being a bank charter to a trust company, or maybe it's doing something with regarding to capital requirements. Those things I think are very important, and I would like to make sure that they kind of stay with the Minerals Committee. That, Mr. Chairman, I stand for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Meyer. Any questions for Mr. Meyer? Any questions? Well, let's talk more about that at the next meeting. We'll get this, I think, drafted as discussed, but that is something that we should weigh. And the reality, as you raised, is we would coordinate those with the committee. What we have right now, and over the last couple of years, was a circumstance where the chairman of the Minerals Committee actually would have liked us to just be able to sponsor it as our own select committee, but had to yield committee time so that they could work the bill, the 2 or 3 bills over the last 2 years, and sponsor them as Minerals Committee bills, taking out of their agenda because they were statutorily bound to. Now, what we could do is provide ourselves with an exception, and maybe we can get that drafted as alternative language. We talked about that before, where right now we're not allowed to, even with permission of the Minerals Committee chairs, to draft it ourselves. But we could have after consultation with the Minerals Committee. So maybe we get that drafted as an alternate where we're no longer restricted from doing it, but we would have to consult with the Minerals Committee chairs. So maybe take a look at it both ways for that. We can talk more about that. We've got ourselves wrapped a little bit around the axle a couple of times over the last few years because the timeline is incredibly challenging based on when the committees meet, and the Minerals Committee really didn't want to have to work a couple of those bills. They would have been happier having us as the sponsors of the bills, but being the good sports they are, they took it on and jammed us into the schedule. So we can look for solutions there. Thank you, Mr. Meyer. Anything else? All right. Thank you, Mr. Meyer. Appreciate it. Any additional public comment? All right. Public comments closed on that topic, and we have an action. But yeah, let's get a little alternate language drafted where the 13 becomes a provision consultation instead of required action, and that might be a good way to satisfy that. All right. Thank you. And with that, Mr. Co-Chairman, we are on to our 2:30 p.m. agenda item on artificial intelligence governance, and looking at a few different topics. We had some legislation last year as well that we'll go back over with Senate File 51. I know we've got some public comment on that, but there are a few topics that are new topics related to, for example, human authorization for decision-making for AI systems. I think we'll move that down below, looking at what other states have been up to, so we'll get back onto that topic. But let's start this conversation off with a review of what other states have been up to, and they've been pretty busy on AI legislation over the past year since we met last. And we also, I'll note, have some good materials on that. You'll see if you look on the website that we've got not only the bill draft, but we've got some good materials on 802, other states' artificial intelligence legislative oversight initiatives that we can pull up. And with that, Ms. Nord, I think you're going to walk us through your findings, and we appreciate this great research.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Clarissa Nord with LSO. I'll just briefly walk through this memo this afternoon, and this memo really aims to review other states' legislation regarding AI liability concerns, and then it also looks at some developing trends in the overall oversight of AI use in both the public and private sectors. And so with respect to liability, there could be some questions surrounding which entity is responsible if someone is potentially harmed by AI. And so I think this memo ended up being a bit broader than what the chairman had originally intended, but we looked at other states who are attempting to define developer responsibilities and then are also looking to establish regulatory frameworks. And so I think this memo really does provide a good overall picture and understanding of the AI regulatory landscape within the country. And, this memo is certainly not all encompassing by any means. It just provides you all with a couple of examples to consider. And so other states have taken a fairly incremental approach in addressing AI, as Ms. Warren indicated in her testimony. And so states are really trying to start by first determining how state government is utilizing AI. And so, for example, here we have Connecticut and Vermont. They enacted legislation that directs their state agencies to conduct an inventory of the systems that are currently in place, and then also to analyze the potential risks of those systems. And then moving on to the next category for interdisciplinary efforts, states certainly are trying to thread the needle in terms of encouraging development while also providing some guardrails. And so they've created some task forces or councils to study the implications of AI, which can include liability issues. And these efforts, at least from our perspective, are very broad in nature. They really seek to monitor the deployment of AI, make policy recommendations, and then assess any liability-related challenges. And so these councils really just provide that foundation and that starting point for establishing that regulatory framework. And so Texas, for instance, they created their AI Advisory Council. And then Utah, this session this year, they enacted the AI Policy Act. It does a number of things, but it imposes liability for the use of AI that violates consumer protection laws if not properly disclosed. It also requires disclosure when an individual interacts with AI in a regulated occupation. So that would include most healthcare providers in that instance. It also creates the AI Learning Laboratory Program, which is effectively a regulatory sandbox for AI. And then the last category I just wanted to quickly highlight here of legislation is automated decision-making legislation. And so this is the regulation of, as the name indicates, but AI-based automated decision-making specifically within the context of employment and healthcare. Those are the two specific areas that gained a lot of traction, but certainly there's other areas this particular type of legislation could apply to. And so this just generally introduces new protections when AI is used to help make significant decisions. And so just a couple of examples here. Massachusetts, last year they considered a bill and reviewed a bill that would have regulated the use of AI in providing mental health services. That bill was not enacted. And then Vermont, they also considered a bill that would restrict the use of AI in employment-related decisions. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Ms. Nord. Questions for Ms. Nord on our research memo? Mr. Co-Chairman, anything? I can go. All right. So, Ms. Nord, it looks like on the inventories, it looks like we have legislation that has passed to create an inventory, but none of them take any explicit action. It's just to get to know what's actually going on. Is that accurate?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct.
Okay. So the only legislation here that I see that takes real strong policy action, the Utah Act on liability for AI that violates consumer protection, that seems to be policy that has a little bit of teeth in that Utah Act. And then maybe that's it, because I think the final ones under the automated decision-making are just looking into it as well. They don't prohibit, do they? And none of them, did any of them pass? It doesn't look like any of them went into effect, the bill specified. So only the Utah bill has gone into effect and has teeth.
Mr. Chairman, I would say that's accurate. That's correct.
Okay. I know that this decision-making authority, the automated decision-making legislation, was something that seems to be highly discussed because you have instances that, you know, hopefully are still few and far between and perhaps somewhat anecdotal, where decisions of public institutions are being made by AI, and upon reflection, that AI might be highly discriminatory, biased, have decision-making issues, and there isn't a human in charge, so to speak, that reflects on it before that decision goes into effect. So are any of these states really looking at that human in control aspect of it? Is that a provision that they're contemplating?
Mr. Chairman, I would have to go back and review the specific legislation, but just off the top of my head, I don't recall any specific provisions relating to that human decision-making.
To my knowledge, we don't have any AI decision-making in state government anywhere in the state. Is that consistent with your belief?
Mr. Chairman, I would have to do a bit more research in terms of what's being deployed currently within the state. Yeah, I don't think I could definitively say either way.
Does anyone know of any? I don't know of any. Representative? Any instance where the state of Wyoming, or even we'll extend it, any of our cities, towns, or counties, are using artificial intelligence for making decisions related to public services? Senator?
Thank you. I'm just trying to think of modeling, if you assisting with like a cell tower, for example, and the community wants to know what it looks like. So you use some kind of computer program to say, what would this tower look like in this particular lot versus this particular lot,
Right.
like the modeling that maybe goes into some of that decision-making?
Gotcha. Okay, but not making the decision necessarily, but providing the input for the decision. I think you're probably right. There's probably a lot of input towards decisions that is being used, but the AI is not, we'll say, pulling the trigger on the decision. Anyone online know of any circumstances? I don't think we have any right now, so we're probably still ahead of that game. Okay. Well, this human authorization aspect is one of the things that we heard about. Leader Yin and I had the opportunity to go to a state legislative leadership foundation event for legislators that was held at Stanford for a few days a while back. President Driscoll and Speaker Summers attended as well, and they focused on a series of different areas of policy related to artificial intelligence. And one of them that seemed to be of immediate concern was this idea of decision-making, where you did have instances around the country where decisions were made, and those were bad decisions that ended up being made that affect people's lives on, public services, and you had people taken off of lists that they should have remained on, and that was detrimental to them. So one possible thing for us to contemplate is ahead of the game, whether we would want artificial intelligence making decisions, and there might be some upside to that, but whether we would want that AI to be allowed to definitively make that decision without a human intervention. And obviously that's a big difference. So that's, I think, an important thing to potentially contemplate. I don't know what the committee thinks. And Representative, do you have anything to add kind of from that time we spent listening to those stakeholders?
Mr. Chairman, yes. So I think one of the things that I took away from that was that there are a bunch of state legislators in a bunch of different states that are getting together to try to work up what their framework looks like. And so I think that's actually headed off by the senator from Connecticut who is running Connecticut's bill. And their goal for that approach was to have I think they described it as a Lego block approach. So you take the blocks of their framework that you would want in your state. So more conservative states might want some sort of framework that more liberal states wouldn't want. And then that way you could craft a legislation from separate blocks, which go into each different part of the policy areas that AI might touch. So whether it's talking about disclosure for generative AI or talking about decision-making risk for what we just mentioned here, their goal was to have several different pieces that you could choose from. I believe another member of that was someone from Colorado, and they also had a bill in progress this year. Might be worth checking on what the status of that is as well.
Thank you, Leader Yin. Any additional thoughts on this topic? And we'll go to public testimony in a moment, but committee, before we open up for public testimony, and we will, I think, look at these two topics, maybe take our public comment, and then separate out the unlawful dissemination of misleading synthetic media after a brief break, and then we'll go to that one is kind of the plan that I have, Mr. Co-Chairman, if that makes sense, so that we can talk about needs for other legislation and explore the space a bit. And then we'll go to that other bill, which I know we'll have discussion on and revisit that legislation is kind of the plan. Does that sound good?
Yeah, Mr. Co-Chair. I certainly, I think the whole dialogue around decision-making, to what level is it enabled, you know, or enhancing or making full-blown decisions, but I think it's a really good conversation, but like all this, we got to bring it into focus and something that we can, that's actually workable. I do think, you know, the idea of, you know, kind of that data provenance, that data traceability and the ability for, you know, for data sets to be audited. I think that might be something worth exploring. Again, it's very conceptual, but I do think that is something that could be really helpful because, as we all know, the better data you put in AI, generally speaking, the better the outputs are. And so I don't know if it's the idea of saying, hey, if you're a generative AI, you want to serve customers in Wyoming, to do so, you know, you have to be willing to, you know, reproduce your data to some kind of auditor or, you know, on some kind of blockchain or whatever that may be. But at a conceptual level, I think that might be an idea worth discussing.
Good points. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Anyone else before we open for public comment? I should note one other area that we talked about and that is possible, but we don't see any other states necessarily taking specific action on it, is the idea of liability associated with artificial intelligence. And that has been tackled in the self-driving vehicle space pretty extensively because it's obviously come up extensively in the self-driving vehicle space. But liability, for example, with provision of mental health or healthcare related, there are a lot of spaces where there is a lack of clarity on how liability would be defined and assigned and capped or anything else, is a wide open space where, once again, there might be beneficial legislation for us to provide, paths to go down and explore. We can be open to that. Or it's possible it's still too early yet, but at the same time, we will be seeing products, and we already are seeing products that work in these spaces that seem relatively ungoverned. And hopefully they're very effective and useful, but at some point somebody will end up with problems. So we do have the provenance concept. We've got the decision-making concept. We've got the liability concept. And any of those is probably ripe for additional consideration. And I think, Mr. Chairman, at the next meeting, we can try and decide which of those topics we might want to tackle and bring in some experts to talk about those specifically as we see fit. So open to ideas. Go ahead.
Mr. Co-Chairman, I think those are three areas that warrant a lot of discussion. I think they have a ton of merit. Obviously there's a lot to bite off there, but I think, by God, if there's a select committee that can do it, we can.
That's right. Emerging technology now, right?
That's right. Yeah, I think as long as we can get some really good folks to teed up for the next meeting to testify, whether it's obviously in the legal space or otherwise, I think there's a really good discussion to be had there. Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Others, go ahead. Senator Ellis, what are your thoughts?
Mr. Chairman, just in looking back at the unlawful dissemination bill, you know, I think where I was uncomfortable with it is just how broad it was. I think going into this election year, certainly I'm not running, but others who are, I am curious to see what's going to happen this election season. I think I would have felt comfortable with this legislation if it were just tailored to campaigns. Like, how does this fit in the universe of campaigns? And then have separate discussions about, you know, misleading the public in other ways through advertising, or, you know, then we can have discussions about libel, slander, you know, using your image. I just think they fit better separated out rather than one big bill, because that's where I start getting lost and start seeing unintended consequences. So I know you mentioned like those silos, but I hate to say more silos, but maybe that's the way of getting there for someone like me.
Well, we'll dive into the unlawful dissemination and try and figure out what to do with that one as well. I do think that deep fake concept we need to find a way to tackle. So that kind of becomes that fourth category, you're right? So we even additional silos for us to consider. Further thoughts before we kind of open up to public comment? All right, so right now, yeah, go ahead, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Mr. Kaufman, as one of the multiple attorneys that we have in this select committee, would you mind weighing in, or what are you thinking?
Yeah,
Again, Mr. Kaufman, on the we'll get to the unlawful dissemination in a little bit, but on these other ideas of human in control, liability, et cetera, what are your thoughts?
yeah, I mean, Mr. Chairman, I don't really have any specific expertise in this area. I think like everybody else, we're kind of seeing this play out in real time. What I was going to say is I think I'm still most interested in those things where we have really good state legal frameworks that we could potentially integrate some of these concepts into, like Trade Secret Act, misappropriation, those types of claims. We have really good state statutes on those things. So to me, to look at potentially building, possible remedies and frameworks within those existing acts, like the Trade Secret Act, makes a lot of sense to me. There's still just so much of this that's going to be dictated at, the federal level for many of the intellectual property issues. So I don't want to see us waste, too much time on those things that we just don't have control over. But I think there's plenty to dive into still.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you. Mr. Pope, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My only comment is on the decision-making component. What we're kind of transitioning to there is regulation of the use and the user, as opposed to the technology itself. And so I think we need to be a little more careful in that area. And if we're going to tackle it, then it needs to be very, very well defined and constrained in what we're trying to do with it. Because of that, because we're not just looking at the technology, we're looking at the use of that technology, and I think it's important that we segregate that out.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Pope. And it's a good point. There are things that we could do. We could set, as we discussed earlier with Ms. Warren, we could set criteria for an AI that the state would use if it were going to utilize an AI. So setting standards might be of benefit. And at that point, that provides us with protection from using a bad AI or an improper or insufficient AI. There might be something to that. That doesn't stifle innovation. That doesn't hold anyone back. That just basically says the state of Wyoming has to keep thinking for itself until an AI is good enough to help. And then the other side of it is potentially even limiting the types of decisions that an AI could engage in, or have a required backstop where you can imagine legislation, for example, that said if an AI generates a decision that is detrimental to a Wyoming person, has a bad outcome that is significant, a human has to come into the game. If it's a trivial decision that doesn't help, doesn't hurt, or helps the person, maybe you don't need to have a decision that involves a human. Something along those lines, right? There might be a rule set that we can put in place that protects our citizens from bad decisions being made without the scrutiny or responsibility of a real human. And that type of policy probably would have stopped the anecdotal things that we saw happening in other states. If a human could have just said, yeah, that doesn't make a lot of sense, we're probably not going to do that, and then click the no box. So I think that's a space that's out there for us to potentially explore. Mr. Pope, did you have a follow-up on that?
Yes, just real quickly to Senator Ellis's point and to Mr. Kaufman's discussion on the deep fake bill. I very much want to see us revisit that.
Mr. Pope, on Mr. Pope, on the deep fakes, we're gonna come to back to that, and we'll separate it out like after a break, just so that we can focus on that. I know we've got public testimony for it, so I wanted to just keep the two so that we can focus on the non-deep fake issues and then come back to the deep fake issues.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yep. All right, anything else at this point? All right, let's open up for public testimony. Again, we will have additional public comment on Senate File 51 in a little bit, but right now, any public comment on the contents of the LSO memo that Ms. Nord presented, or the ideas of human authorization, exploring that further, liability, provenance, or anything along those lines at this point. And again, we'll probably be looking for speakers next time on these topics. Anyone in the room? All right, not at this time. Anyone online? All right, Mr. Marr, come on in.
Great. Can
Mr.
everybody
Marr,
hear me?
once again, introduce yourself. We can hear you. Welcome. Introduce yourself once again, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Chairman Rothfuss and committee. My name is Brendan Marr. I'm an MIT Media Laboratory alumnus. I'm involved in the working groups for digital identity, the DAO-X, and registered digital assets, etc. I've got a number of things to comment here, which I hope will be constructive for the committee going forward. And I should say, I've been involved in, the beginnings of AI back when I was at the Media Lab, when Marvin Minsky was there, and the software agents groups. And we've been thinking about these implications of general AI for 25, 30 years. But now it's coming to scale. That being said, what I'd like to offer to the group is a few thoughts. Primarily, the fact that AI is going to be in everything. You're going to, type a letter to your friend, or whatever you do in Microsoft Word, or whatever you create, it's going to be in every single facet of our lives. That means that we have to be very, very careful in terms of how we define AI. It will be impossible, next to impossible, to constrain AI and put limitations on it by, just using broad terms of AI. Really, what's going to have to happen goes towards what Ms. Warren had said earlier. It is inevitable that these things will have a blockchain basis. That brings us to the construct that Wyoming is now at the epicenter of the digital future of everything. And what's standing in the way is the first piece to all of this, which we keep going back to, which is identity, which is digital identity, and how that is perfected through cryptographic signatures. We have solutions to this. Wyoming has statute that can solve these problems. Many of the things I've been discussing for years, but now I hope it's becoming clearer how these can be used. For one would be, we have the DUNA Act, right, with that, which just came into law, that will actually play a large role related to governance at a protocol level, and these things will have a protocol basis. That's one piece of this. It is important to also note that there's this idea that's been floating around regarding the idea of statutory trusts, or data trusts, I should say, more specifically. It turns out that it just might be that the DUNA is a mechanism for managing data, because it is based in protocol, and based in protocol for managing data. But what is the other piece? The other piece that Wyoming has, which is 100% underutilized at this point, is the Series LLC, right? Because the Series LLC and the Series children provide a lightweight mechanism for being able to bind identity to these oracles of information that are controlled, potentially by Aduna or other corporations or other LLCs. So we have the pieces, we just need to work through them. But the fundamental pieces come down to identity, and that's where we're at. This is the problem. I hope that helps, and I'll take some questions.
Thank you, Mr. Marr. Questions for Mr. Marr? Go ahead, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. Certainly the idea of using the our DUNA Act for AI regulation is really interesting, but I was wondering if you could expand on that and how specifically the provisions within our DUNA Act are perfectly or well suited for regulating AI.
Mr. Marr.
Yes, and I don't believe that this is a complete solution, right? I think the DUNA was designed specifically for solving problems in the United States for DAOs that are protocol based. There's certainly a lot about AI which is not protocol based, but is very human centric. But some aspects will be protocol based, in terms of, and the way to think about that, Representative Western, is the fact that you have data that's coming into a system and data that's going out of a system, and fundamentally that is and can be made into a protocol. Now, you have to be a little careful here because these systems have interfaces now which are now text and language and prompts. So exactly how all this plays out is going to be interesting, but somewhere in all this there is the opportunity for DUNAs as a governance body having the ability to govern what goes into an AI and what comes out of an AI for certain kinds of systems. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you, Brendan. Go ahead, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Mr. Co-Chairman Brennan, it does. Thank you very much.
All right, any additional questions for Mr. Marr? Okay, seeing none. Thank you, Mr. Marr. Appreciate those comments.
Sure.
Any additional public comment at this time? Okay, seeing none, we're going to take a 10-minute break at this point. We'll meet back up at 3:30, so a 13-minute break until 3:30. And then we'll start back up with consideration of 2024 Senate File 51, unlawful dissemination of misleading synthetic media. So back at 3:30. See y'all then. All right, let's get started again. All right, so the next item on the agenda is a consideration of 2024 Senate File 51, unlawful dissemination of misleading synthetic media. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. So for this legislation, David, I'd ask that you come up and let's walk through it again and kind of go over the way that it's currently drafted. While David's getting ready, as a reminder, this legislation we drafted and worked last session. It got about halfway through the process and died in House committee, and there was some concern on a few different points. We did have some amendments drafted that are not included in this bill draft, right? This is the bill draft that, go ahead. They are included. Oh, okay, so this is the engrossed version. It is, all right. This is the engrossed version. So this is as it passed the Senate, went over to the House. So with that, Mr. Hopkinson, if you would walk us through.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. David Hopkinson with the Legislative Service Office, walking through Senate File 2024 Senate File 51. Starting on page 2 then, first thing I kind of want to highlight, we've got the definition section here as the bill creates a new article 4030-201. And I want to stop and highlight A2, synthetic media, because this definition really does a lot that I think people who on initial blush at the bill might not realize. But it defines synthetic media, and that's an image, audio record, or video record of a natural person's appearance, speech, or conduct that has been intentionally manipulated or generated in a manner to create a realistic but false image, audio, or video, or other representation that to a reasonable person is of a real natural person in appearance, action, or speech, which appearance, action, or speech did not actually occur, and which would cause a reasonable person to believe the appearance, action, or speech occurred. So right there, you've got a lot of what might otherwise be considered synthetic media on just a regular look at the term that would not apply, that there's a lot of exceptions created there. You know, it has to be of a person that a reasonable person would believe is of a real natural person, and that the speech or action did not actually occur, but that reasonable person would believe that it occurred because of this. So there's just a lot of, it's doing a lot of legwork.
There's a lot
just
there.
that definition. And so I think it would cut out a lot of concerns that some people may have just based on that definition, because it does have to fit that definition for the rest of this bill to apply. Subsection B then gets into or provides that a person engages in unlawful dissemination of misleading synthetic media when they knowingly and intentionally disseminate synthetic media, knowing it to be synthetic media. So here again, some more limitations. The person who sends it out would have to know that it was synthetic media, and otherwise they may have a defense. Moving to page 3, this requirement to disseminate, I kind of overlooked here, back on page 2, that provides that they disseminate this synthetic media without subdivision A on page 3, displaying clear and conspicuous notice in a visual synthetic media, identifying it as synthetic media. B provides that if it's not, or that if it's audio only or otherwise visual disclosure is not feasible, then they provide a disclosure within the audio, and it provides requirements for that. And that they do all this with the intent to mislead others about the appearance, actions, or speech of the natural person represented in the synthetic media. So there is that intent requirement that would need to be met for it to fall within this prohibition. Subsection C then provides that any person who is depicted or who is misled by synthetic media in violation of that subsection can maintain a civil action to enjoin or restrain the dissemination of that synthetic media. And they may seek damages from the person who disseminated the synthetic media, and a court may award, over on page 4, equitable relief, damages, costs and fees, including attorney's fees, or exemplary damages in an amount not less than $1,000 per plaintiff. Subsection D provides that the Attorney General may enforce the provisions of this article and investigate violations. Subsection E provides that the Attorney General or any district attorney may on behalf of the state bring an action for a temporary or permanent injunctive or other relief in any court of competent jurisdiction. And the court may, upon final entry, finding a violation of the article, award restitution when appropriate. Subsection F on page 5, the article shall not prohibit actions under other statutory. So subsection F is really getting at, if you want to sue under this article, that's your remedy under this article, but it does not preclude you from suing for other reasons. For example, if there was a libel or slander case, a type of case to be made, you could still sue under other provisions of law. But if you want to sue under this provision, it has to be according to this provision. Subsection G provides that a person who disseminates synthetic media with malicious intent to influence the outcome of any election within the state of Wyoming or to facilitate any other criminal act is guilty of a misdemeanor, punishable by a fine of not punishable by imprisonment for not more than 6 months, a fine not more than $750 or both. So there we have a criminal element to this when they are doing it with malicious intent or those other factors. Subsection H is the primary change that was made in the Senate to this engrossed bill that was not in the version that passed the committee last year. So we're seeing what the Senate added. And they added some exceptions, provided in H that this section shall not apply to, and it exempts out under paragraph 1, radio or television broadcasting station, including cable or satellite television operator, that broadcasts an election communication that includes synthetic media prohibited by subsection B as part of a bona fide newscast, news interview, news documentary, or on-the-spot coverage of a bona fide news event, if the broadcast clearly acknowledges through content or disclosure that there are questions about the authenticity of the synthetic media. So this is basically a protection for news media and carves out an exemption under those circumstances. Paragraph 2 provides an exemption for any entity who broadcasts an advertisement without censorship under 47 USC 315. That statute applies to candidates, lawful candidates for any public office, that they are allowed to basically broadcast their message, assuming the broadcaster agrees, and it prohibits the broadcaster from censoring or editing the message that they have. So then it just provides some protection for that broadcaster. And then finally, under paragraph 3, provides an exception for an internet service provider, search engine, cloud service provider, or any affiliate or subsidiary that disseminates misleading synthetic media solely as a result of providing access or connection to information or content on the internet that are not under the provider or engine's control, to the extent that the provider or engine is not responsible for the creation of that misleading synthetic media. So that carves out a protection basically for your typical internet company, that if they're just providing access to the internet, they're not going to be liable for the dissemination. And finally, subsection J provides that dissemination of any synthetic media protected under the First Amendment shall not be deemed to violate this section. And with that, I would stand for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hopkinson. Any questions at this time? Go ahead, Representative Singh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Hopkinson. Based with the wording that we have currently with what was Senate File 51, would an advertisement, say I had a business that I was selling makeup and I was going to have an advertisement where someone was wearing some of this makeup, but I decided to use, Photoshop to make this person look different than they actually look in real life through a series of minor changes. And I did that specifically to sell my product. Would that be affected by this bill?
Mr. Hopkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Representative Singh. In looking at the language of the bill, I think there are probably a few places that would take it out of the realm of this bill. You're looking at the question, I think, it may go to, a reasonable person. Are they going to believe, that there may not be any changes to this in current society? I think there's an argument that a reasonable person would understand this is an advertisement. Off the cuff, I can certainly delve more into the details of that to give you a better answer, but I'd leave it at that for now.
Representative, it's an interesting line. Do you have any follow-up on that? So synthesizing advertising, I think it's an interesting concept where you could entirely fabricate an advertisement.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'm aware of, there is some controversy around what people are able to have in advertisements and the standards that advertisements set for people, the precedent of how they choose to then perceive themselves based off of comparing themselves to these advertisements. So would then, if someone were to look at an artificially generated or manipulated piece of media that was an advertisement and they get a false impression of, how they should conduct themselves, would that fall under the purview of what this bill talks about?
And Mr. Hopkinson, thoughts?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do think that is a fair question and certainly up for discussion by the committee. I know in previous versions of the bill, we had exceptions carved out for consent of the person being depicted, but that, I don't think is in this latest version. That's all. I mean, that is an interesting question, given the language right now.
And for that circumstance, you really, well, it's probably realistic in the next few years. Why would you hire actors or actresses for a commercial, as an example? Or a few years down the road for a movie, when you can digitally generate that. So you have your lipstick commercial where it's just trying on lipstick, showing it off, and it was entirely synthesized, all deep fake. I don't know that that is delineated out clearly. It might be, but it is a circumstance where would there be a harm to be misled by that you think it's real if it's an advertisement in that circumstance where you're advertising products? It's a good question. Senator Ellis, thoughts?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been a year since I've looked at this, but I remember when I was a law student, I worked for a company and did some research on this. And the FTC has guidelines on if you are a paid actor and you see them on commercials that say, this paid actor is used for this endorsement of a product. I mean, they just want the disclosure. And I think that's what I'm struggling is our law is written as everything's unlawful unless we say it's okay, versus we're assuming that this law is targeted just to advertising and truth in advertising. And how do we, model what we're trying to achieve with FTC guidelines that are out there that just says, this commercial was used models generated through artificial intelligence. Then there's the disclaimer, then it's done. But it's presumed that that's an okay habit as long as you disclose that. So this is, so we've got the universe of what's broadcast on television. Then we're trying to figure out marketing on the internet, and that gets a little different and strange, because there are different rules and not as many rules. So I think that's just where I'm struggling is with some of these concepts is, we're talking about campaigns, we're talking about advertising, we're talking about hurting someone's image and what you own. So I'm just so to bring this back to a question is, did you, in drafting this bill, look at some of the FTC guidelines out there about just truth in advertising and what's already on the books? And would this fit into that realm, to Representative Singh's point of, let's talk about commercials, TV commercials that are, I guess, made in Wyoming or broadcast in Wyoming?
It would be broadcast because, again, this is the dissemination aspect and you have the opportunity for the action. But on the FTC side of you need a little disclaimer, I think that's a good example where a disclaimer becomes a solution for the speech side of it. You can do anything you want in this bill if you put a disclaimer. Everything's okay. The moment you add the disclaimer, that's obviated under page 3, right after that Romanet 1. If you've got either a visible disclaimer or an audible disclaimer under A and B, that's your absolute get out of jail card.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think what I'm struggling with, though, is just kind of what I said before, a TV commercial, we know how those are put out. There's certain 30 seconds, 1 minute. And this all gets a little different when it's, we talked about this when we worked the bill, is just the rules of the internet and regulating how that works. So that's where it gets a little less clear to me on how some of this, how these concepts fit together, but.
Mhm. Other thoughts, discussion on this point? Go ahead, Representative Singh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess, even if whatever the media was, if it wasn't generated using an algorithm or using an AI to make it, but instead you just used Photoshop to digitally alter a piece of media, would that then require this statement somewhere on the media?
What are your thoughts, Mr. Hopkinson?
Mr. Chairman, the language, that definition of synthetic media did change quite a bit throughout the course of this bill's discussion last interim. But I think we took out the language that kind of would have limited it to an algorithmically generated. And now it's just got the language that it's been intentionally manipulated or generated. So I think potentially Photoshop under certain circumstances would fall within that definition.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it's structured that way. And again, the discussion on that was just the fact that why does it matter how you've manipulated it if you're intentionally misleading? Is there anything unique about generative AI other than it does it very well for a video? But it's a good question. And it, as drafted, it includes images, audio records, video records, all of the above. And there are various ways to manipulate each of those, whether it's through something like Photoshop or audio editors, video editors. This provides a broad approach to allowing that to be manipulated with the intent to mislead and disseminating it. One thing that is left out, oddly enough, of the synthetic media, this is alteration of a natural person's appearance at the end of the day as the key focus of it, which it has been the key focus of it. But, there was an instance last year of flames rising from Hawaii, basically creating a false circumstance where you're basically creating a natural disaster in that little deep fake, which went viral, so that people had the impression of a false circumstance and believed that there was a wildfire in a place where there was no wildfire. This would not cover that as drafted, but that might be significant as well. All right, you might be given the impression of false events, and we saw the use of deep fakes in military actions around the world over the last year as well, where you did not have manipulation of any particular individual, or in some cases you did, but the ones I'm thinking of were deep fakes that basically created circumstances that looked like military actions, but again, were fabricated, but you were creating a deep fake of a military action without an individual being manipulated, but rather creating circumstances of it. And again, that would not necessarily fall under this definition either. So it would provide a pretty significant loophole possibility to mislead the public. The key concept again is trying to provide an opportunity to ensure that the public is not intentionally misled for some purpose, and that right to understand the veracity of the information. And it goes to the question, do we individuals have a right to know that something's true in any way? Right now, you have no such right. Everyone has the right to lie to you, pretty dramatically. There might be exceptions to that when you get to libel and slander, but there are plenty of ways that you can be openly lied to and misled to shape your belief system, to shape your politics, to shape your actions, to shape your opinion of individuals, of things, of products. As I think that's a really interesting space that Representative Singh brings up. Where I can virtually make a product work really well right? Then that might be false advertising at that point where there actually are some laws, but it's hard to say. But that's the space. Other questions and discussion on the bill as drafted. Representative Yin, I know you had concerns about this legislation. Let's talk through those concerns as well. Try and get to all of the concerns raised.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I think, and so I'm trying to remember how much of this bill I'm remembering correctly versus the bill that we have in front of us. But I think the example that I gave was if you could just Photoshop a photo of me and you put it in front of a stockpile of nuclear bombs and then say, with the speech bubble coming out of my mouth that says Mike Yin loves nuclear bombs, do you need, I mean, I think that would fall under the statutory guidance of saying that that would be illegal without a disclosure. Would you need an extra crime for that, or sorry, would you need another liability for that, or would just libel be enough? And so in those situations, I'm still unconvinced, frankly, that we need the extra bill, the extra protection, versus what laws that we have in place now. So I guess what I need convincing of is, what does this bill bring in regards to protection that I would need instead of a law that we have in the place now? So I need an example where a law that we have in place now would not be enough coverage to protect a person who is either being misrepresented or misled.
On that one, how would you deal with a circumstance where you were misled by a national political candidate that was out of the state of Wyoming, and you were misled by false heroism of that candidate? So going back to, you have a candidate for the presidency arbitrarily of the United States that saves 5 people from a burning building, and you believe fully after watching that video that that presidential candidate saved 5 people from a burning building. What action would you, as an individual that's misled, have in that circumstance? What law would protect you?
Mr. Chairman, I think that's an excellent question. And so, and I think that speaks to maybe we could focus it towards elections. Being misled, if it wasn't a product, but we're talking about an election, right? Because then you're talking about somebody's reputation that they're trying to either enhance or denigrate someone else's reputation. It would only be the person who is being misrepresented that I think would have some cause of action. But again, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know necessarily whether that person who is being misled, so the audience member rather than any of the people being represented, has any course of action.
Yeah, I don't think you have any, and I don't think there's any protection also unless it's a financial harm most of the time. And it's only as the victim of the financial harm, which tends to be if that candidate were detracted from and could show a financial harm, there might be a mechanism. But you, as a misled individual, could never bring that action. So it assumes that there is no, in the case of an election, it assumes that you have no claim on the value of your vote in that instance, that it's of no consequence. Misleading you into falsely voting a way that you wouldn't otherwise has no value, which is the state of affairs right now. Do you see it otherwise? I mean, do you see where you could bring any action? I don't see where you could bring any action under the current system.
Mr. Chairman, I do think that seems like a reasonable space that we could apply a law like this. It just feels less useful in spaces outside of that situation you've presented. So whether it's misrepresenting Taylor Swift, who clearly would have reputational harm being inflicted on her if she was misrepresented in a way that was negative. Or things like revenge porn, which are situations where real harm is being inflicted, and I think a court under current law would be able to find
Well,
situations.
with the Taylor Swift example, you've got one Taylor Swift, and how many million Swifties are we up to, think? Let's just say 300 million Swifties. And we've got, yeah, me too, go Swiftie. You've got one Taylor Swift and 300 million Swifties. And the assumption of the current system is that misinformation about Taylor Swift can harm Taylor Swift. But the 300 million Swifties are literally of no consequence under current law. And the fact that they've been misled is of no consequence. And that's how we do it. That is how it's done. I don't understand why we have arrived at the fact that being misled is not of value, but being misled under statute is not of value. You have no recourse. You have no action. That's the difference with this legislation. I agree in this circumstance, T Swift can probably bring an action and get something blocked or get something done, particularly if she knows who it is that created it. But the interesting recourse looking forward is this idea, and honestly, this is where deep fakes become different, because in my view, there is a value to knowing whether you've been handed the truth or not, but there's no mechanism in any statute to provide surety. We do have things like Senator Ellis was mentioning, though, of some truth in advertising provisions, a little bit of consumer protection there where you can't get overtly lied to, but at the same time, I have never bought a fast food burger that looked anything like it does on the commercials. So we know that that's a deep fake right there, right? Oh, I see a couple hands up. Representative Ocean Andrew, to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was wondering, I was wanting to go back to an example by the good representative from Teton County about the image he conjured up that implied he liked nuclear weapons. And that made me kind of consider whether or not this bill leaves room for satire or comedy, because while that definitely would not lead me to believe that he really loved nuclear weapons, it could lead someone to believe that. And you know, I think you could probably bring in the topic of intent, whether it was intended to lead someone to believe that or not. But you know, if that wasn't the intention, could, you know, I was just kidding be a reasonable defense to almost any of this?
Representative Andrew, I think a lot of that is certainly intended to be covered on page 3 in the Romanet 2. It's clear that it has to be with the intent to mislead others about the appearance, actions, or speech of the natural person. So you actually have to intend to mislead. And then you also have the provision on page 2 within the definition that talks about a reasonable person has to believe that that representation is of a real person taking action or the speech occurred. The idea there being, and again, even the instance, the moment you put the little speech bubble, that fails to meet the definition here, right? Nobody's going to believe that. Satire isn't going to be believed. I think that is an important concern. We want to make sure we're protecting satire, but I don't think the reasonable person standard is the intent of allowing for satire. Explicitly allowing for satire was something we discussed before. The concern is if you said, well, we always allow satire, and then somebody, what's the first thing you would do if you were actually at some point tracked to be the creator of something which was an intentional misleading depiction? You would immediately say, well, obviously that was satire. So the intent or the reasonable person standard then replaces that claim of intent to provide any efficacy, where I just can't imagine someone wouldn't, if caught, immediately claim it was obviously satire, even if it wasn't, if it was an intent to mislead. Does that make sense, Representative?
Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll have to think about that one a little more.
Okay. Let's see, Mr. Pope, and then I see Mr. Kaufman has his hand up also. Mr. Pope, to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with you in that this broadens who can recover from this type of action to the normal average person. It gives them power. The person that is deceived has power that they really don't have in very many other circumstances. And it makes recovery easier, and it really drives it down to giving an average person the ability to counteract this, and it provides a huge deterrent to those who would deceive people through the use of the technology. So yes, I agree with you on that. I believe that under current law, it is just so difficult for anyone to be made whole again after this type of deception. So that is really all I had to say on that.
Thank you, Mr. Pope. Mr. Kaufman.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple of comments, but first I have a question, if I may, just for Mr. Hopkinson, because he's done far more research on this than I have. But I'm curious, in comparing and contrasting any other legislation that is out there, are people using this intent standard as part of that legislation? Because to me, that's a really novel concept in a private civil right of action to have an intent element. And so I'm just curious if we're seeing that out there. I'm by no means an expert on AI legislation or causes of action. So I'm just curious if what Mr. Hopkinson's seeing out there, if there's anything that he's relying on.
Mr. Hopkinson, have you seen that elsewhere?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kaufman, much of the language in this bill is consistent with what other states have done with respect to, well, primarily what you see in other states is specific to elections. And so a good chunk of this is consistent with what you would see in some of those other states with respect to elections. I don't recall specifically on that intent to mislead element of it, but I can certainly check into that and get back to you.
Mr. Kaufman, go ahead with your other points.
Yeah, so Mr. Chairman, just to follow up, that, I mean, that makes sense to me in some respects with respect to narrowly tailoring this to elections, and I totally understand that concern. Just listening to the debate, and again, I'll tell everyone, I am not an intellectual property expert, but I know enough to be dangerous in some areas. This conversation, I mean, we're bringing in and introducing a whole lot of concepts from different bodies of law, and I'm a little worried that we're missing the mark on a bunch of them. I'll give you a couple of examples, right? Let's say, so I've referred many times to the Trade Secret Act, which I think is a really standard piece of state law that we have that creates a private right of action. If you misappropriate someone's trade secret, it's a per se style cause of action. Either it happened or it didn't, right? There can be additional damages added onto that if there was malicious intent or something like that proven. But to require the intent to mislead is again, in my mind, just a really unique circumstance for a tort style kind of cause of action. So I'm worried that we're creating a standard that's going to be very, very difficult to meet or for anyone to actually use. Then again, similarly, we've kind of weaved in some principles of, trademark and copyright and this likelihood of confusion and how reliable is this information? What's the obligation to tell the truth in those things? again, to me, if we are just broadly applying language like this to any circumstance, that becomes really, really, really hard to enforce or for anyone to ever prove. So again, I'm thinking ahead of unintended consequences. Are we creating so much leeway in that definition? I mean, again, I'm just going to point back to the language of the bill on page 2. A person engages in unlawful dissemination of misleading synthetic media when they knowingly and intentionally disseminate. And then further down, we say with the intent to mislead. So they have to knowingly and intentionally disseminate it with an intent to mislead. That is, I mean, that's a lot right there to try to prove, right? That somebody did in a private right of action. So again, I know we have experts in the room that have worked on this from around, the country and at the federal level. I'd love to know how people are thinking about that intent element, because to me, that's just so, I mean, I'm sure somebody else can come up with an example. The only circumstance I can think of in Wyoming law right now off the top of my head that we have an intent element in a private tort-like cause of action is like securities, right? We have the scienter standard in any securities action where somebody has to knowingly, right, be deceiving the investor or something like that. But I mean, a contractual claim, negligence claim, I mean, we have all these standards of law that don't require that intent to create the cause of action. So I just raised the point, Mr. Chairman. I just want maybe people to think about that carefully, because I'm concerned that we're creating a cause of action that's unwieldy and unuseful, and at the end of the day, it's going to be easy to avoid and not really accomplish. So one suggestion would be to really narrowly tailor this to elections. And I think in that context, it probably is easier to define that motive, right? And now we're not dealing with parity, sort of the derivatives of defamation law and the exceptions for causes of action under defamation or even copyright law. But I think we need to maybe pick that lane, at least would be my suggestion to the committee, because right now it feels like we're stepping in a minefield a little bit.
Thank you, Mr. Kaufman. Any other concepts, though, about what could be changed if the concern is that much specificity and that high of a bar? And you're right. When this was drafted, the bar was created pretty high to ensure protection of First Amendment rights and make sure that you weren't getting into the parody realm, right? Intent to deceive as opposed to intent to amuse, for example. Yep, go ahead, Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm just sitting here, and as I was looking at just kind of, again, it's the different concepts. Like in election law, I think it's pretty straightforward. Are you intending to influence an election? And that could be issue-based or candidate-based. When it's advertising, there's, I think, a different standard. I think, and it's much lower. I mean, we hold professional companies and they're worried about their brand. They want to comply. So it's a lower standard. And then, when it's attacking someone else's character, it's different. So that's my concern with the bill, is it's mushing it all together. And, I think if I would feel more comfortable if we were to try and take it piece by piece, like what are we trying to solve today? Is it our concern about deepfakes being used to influence elections? That to me is a very clear thing we can really focus on. Are we concerned about consumers being misled about products? Okay, then we can look at FTC guidance that's already out there and the laws that exist. I just think if we take it in smaller chunks, we'll have a better understanding of what we're trying to achieve, because right now it's all these different intents: intent to mislead, intent to influence an outcome, intent to mislead a consumer. So if I'm wrong, I just want to thank Mr. Kaufman. I think he was doing a better job of articulating some of the concerns we've been having offline during our breaks.
Great. Thank you, Senator Ellis. Mr. Kaufman, anything else to add at this time?
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wholeheartedly agree with those comments. So yeah, thank you, Senator.
Great, thank you. Anyone else want to weigh in at this point before we go to public comment? Yep, go ahead, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. I think ultimately it's the gap in coverage, right? And obviously, Mr. Kaufman can speak more articulately. I think certainly part of the rationale in having it as broad as it is in terms of who it applies to really comes down to having the ability to have some type of action. I mean, I think if we're going back to the example that Representative Yin used, if someone makes that picture, they can do that now. There's no more recourse. It's already on the books. It's the idea that you are using something to intentionally mislead that person as their opinion, as in, do you have the right to freedom of speech of another person's freedom of speech and represent it as their own opinion? I think that's kind of the core concept. And I think because the threshold is set at Can you prove that there's a monetary damage to that person? It really confines it only to that being the metric if damage has been caused versus this person has put out media saying I did this or I did that, saying that it actually was me. And it gives that recourse that I think is good for everybody, right? Certainly there can be argued that if this is just for elected officials, well, we're kind of just doing ourselves a little bit of favor and leaving everybody else in the dark and exposed to, the risks that this type of technology has. Thank you,
Yeah.
Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The other challenge is, and most states, obviously, that have enacted something have enacted election-related legislation that has loopholes that you can easily drive trucks through. And I don't know if it will really have much influence in the end, because you can certainly, again, create a false positive instead of a false negative. No state anticipates anything like that. Nobody has any right to action because they were misled. It's only somebody who is being deep faked for an adverse action where they look bad. And again, you can circumvent that easily. You don't have to, if you just fake a person talking badly, those kinds of things are all manageable. And the challenge here is you have incredibly smart and sophisticated people that are taking this action, and you have laws that are very narrowly defined. And so you just read this law and you think, all right, well, here are the 10 ways that I can achieve my interest of misleading people without violating this law. The hope with this bill was to try and find a way to not make it so easy, because it's misleading someone intentionally that becomes the problem, instead of here's the laundry list of ways that we will ban you from misleading someone. And then they just say, oh, okay, well, I'll work around that. And so the challenge, I understand the desire to make it a series of different pieces. I just don't know if that accomplishes anything, because you don't even have to be particularly clever to work around any of those pieces. And again, a lot of these bills have passed and they just don't look challenging. They don't look like they take much longer than 25 minutes of conversation over a beer to circumvent. Mr. Coppin, your hand's up.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, and this might be a dangerous road to go down as a question, but I pose this question to the committee members. I mean, is anyone aware, are there instances of laws that sort of work in the inverse, right? So we're thinking about this as a remedy, which I appreciate, but the problem with a remedy is it's always retroactive, right? The damage may arguably have been done already in an election. And even if you have a private right of action, there may not be a way to enjoin, right, what's happening quickly enough to stop it, for example, before the election occurs. So I'm just curious if transparency and sort of permission is kind of the goal, is it worth looking at? Look, generally in Wyoming, if you're going to use generative AI in elections, you have to, right, file some disclosure and register. And then unless you do that, right, then you're not permitted to do it. I'm just wondering if we've looked at that from the inverse. And again, I'm not suggesting that that's a great idea, but if we're going down the paths of election, and if we're going down the path of sort of transparency and trying to protect that private right of action, I mean, again, whether you look at the Trade Secret Act or copyright law or, any of them, they're all retroactive remedies unless you have a right to enjoin the activity up front. So again, I raise that for everybody to consider. And in the context of elections, maybe that's something that's doable. Probably in the broader context of just, regular advertising and commerce, that's not going to work. But I just throw that out.
No, it's a good point. And I think having the capacity to enjoin, I think, is important. One of the other aspects, though, in the way this was structured, which is different from how others are structured, is the fact that if you knowingly propagate the message, you could have liability against claims against you by a large group of people. So that creates the creator is unlikely to ever be found or seen in an egregious case of something like this, right? You're not going to figure out who that is. So bringing an action against that individual only in rare circumstances would be useful. having the disclaimer obviously kind of makes things okay. All right, this is false. Don't believe this. As structured, this would provide motivation for anybody that was disseminating the message to ensure that if they found out it was an illegitimate message or a deep fake, that a disclaimer needed to be put there. And they're not the ones that created the message, but they're the ones that benefit from viral messaging. As this is structured, they would have financial motivation to ensure compliance because they would not want to see an after the fact lawsuit. And that's the mechanism in this legislation that's different from any other state. No other state has that private right of action. And that was what was pushed against. And honestly, that's the reason that this might actually work, because you would not want to knowingly and willfully propagate misinformation as a provider with this legislation in place. Mr. Kaufman, go ahead.
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, those are great points. I mean, the only part of that I would just maybe push back on again is this intent question, because we are leaving that right and the ability to enforce that right to some subjective standard of what this intent is. Let me give you an example, right? What if I do a generative AI skit of you, Senator Rothfuss, saying, you know, I'm totally opposed to all form of, you know, future taxation, right? I might think that's good. I could argue that that's a good thing, and I'm doing it to help you. And this is an extreme example, maybe, but I think you see where I'm going with this. That is, the subjectiveness of that standard that creates the right of action is incredibly circumstantial. And that's going to be really, really hard for anybody to determine real time. Now, obviously, in extreme cases, like Representative Yin's example of, you know, the nuclear weapons or something, right? There's going to be extreme examples. But I think the bigger risk here is the more nuanced examples, right? Where it could be believable and it could be something that's really hard to discern. And again, to your point, if we're relying on that intent standard, again, to me, we're providing a remedy with no realistic way to enforce it, or at least not in a timely fashion. And I don't know what the answer is, but I just keep coming back to that.
Yeah, and Senator Ellis, I know that you have to go pretty soon, so I want to make sure that we give you an opportunity to share your thoughts at this point.
Well, Mr. Chairman, maybe that's a good question of what are you looking for achieving today? Is it advancing the bill draft that we had from last session to tweak it, or are we looking at maybe coming up with different smaller bill drafts? Which I know, I hear you, but I'm just, I know I'm not there.
I think a solution, honestly, I think we're looking for a way to try and achieve the objective. If this bill doesn't achieve that objective, what are the alternatives? And then kind of vetting those. It's a good discussion to talk through. And it's not an easy problem, right? No other state has cracked it, and I think all of their legislation that I've read is pretty bad. They've done something, right? And so you can say we've done something, and you can hold up your bill and say, hey, we passed something, election integrity is assured. But when you read through them, it's just not good legislation. We could do that. We can pass the same bills they passed, and we can say we did something about it, but it's not going to protect the people of Wyoming from being misled. It's just going to make it slightly more challenging to mislead them, assuming that, and again, most of them actually hold the creator responsible. And if the creator is responsible, then don't even worry about it if that's the only problem, because you'll never find the creator that's hiding in a lair someplace on the other side of the planet, coding away and having a great time. But yeah, I mean, if we have any ideas on how to solve this problem and get to something that actually protects the public, that's what we're looking for. Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I just think, in my view, the smaller bites in getting it right and really thinking it through, like election law to me makes complete sense. And I would push back on the assertion that this only protects the candidates. It is about making sure that the public has access to some accurate information. But if we do that, then we can look at what is the intent. Is the intent malicious? I don't think we need to go that far. I think the intent is, are you trying to influence an election outcome? I just think we can manage it more. And I think we've got more examples of how we all know how this works. If someone's putting what we think is misleading mailers out there, we've all seen those. Do we hold the printing press liable? No, we are looking at, the candidate committees and those outside groups, what's in their filing. That's where I think there's some assurance in the public of how that information is being disseminated. What I keep hearing with this bill time and again is how far is the reach on the broadcaster? Is it a television company, a cable network? Is it the internet service provider? Is it a social media platform? And I think that's where people start getting really nervous about what we're trying to achieve and who's in charge of what. And down to, hired someone to build my website and I want them to put this information on there. I'm driving the content, but the web person's the one who built it. So, I want to tease out some of those issues of, who's behind the messaging, putting in the inputs, not just the person, quote unquote, who created it. And I don't think that some of those concerns are well thought out in this particular bill. And that's where I think there's a lot of unease. So in my view, if we tackle a couple of issues, maybe campaign, maybe advertising, and try and get at it after that way, because otherwise we're marching into the space of defamation. And there are a lot of laws written on that. And I'm not an expert on that, but to Representative Yin's point, what is the harm to your person, your business, your reputation? Am I expressing an opinion that I have a right to do that I don't like someone in a political space or in my community? That's protected speech, right? We can't legislate against all of it, is my view, without seriously looking at First Amendment violations.
Thank you, Senator. Additional discussion, Mr. Co-Chairman? Yeah. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. I think we're getting really close to confusing the right to First Amendment versus my right to your First Amendment rights. And I think obviously these are absolutely, you should be able to say whatever you want, whenever you want, but do I have the right to say that you are the one that's actually expressing this opinion? I think that's really at the core level what we're trying to get at in the component of extending this to folks beyond elected officials. So
thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. Mr. Pope.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think there's a lot of value in taking this in smaller bites, and if we have to confine it to political actions in the near term, what it will allow us to do is work through the language, work through the concepts, and build a framework that I would love to see expanded in the future. But I see no issue at all with trying to take things in smaller chunks.
Thank you, Mr. Pope. Representative Andrew.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My suggestion would be that if we want to do something here, that we look at our codified tort laws, like libel, slander, and specifically address these types of actions where those torts are actually codified, and consider bringing in uncodified torts such as false light into the same conversation. There's quite a few more that aren't codified in Wyoming law that could still be used, but perhaps it would help if we want a way to address this specifically.
Thank you, Representative. I think one of the challenges there, though, is that you always have to have that financial harm in almost all of those, and it has to be to a specific actor, where protecting a public ability to know a fact basis, I don't know that that's in there. I guess I'd ask Mr. Coffin. I know you're not deeply involved in practicing in this space, but it seems that those typical statutory interpretations don't align with this idea that I have perhaps a right to know what is true.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not even not trying to dodge the question. I'm not really sure how to answer the question. I mean, so many of our causes of action are common law derived. I mean, a lot of our common law actions are derived from just amalgamations of case law that are put together to construct what the court requires as elements that you have to prove on various torts. Some of them are codified in specific statute, and I guess if what you're getting at is how do you more tightly define that remedy, if I'm understanding your question correctly, the remedy certainly could be, and that's sorry, I'm jumping ahead, the remedy could be defined in statute, and that's why in my mind I think I keep going to some of the intellectual property statutes like the Trade Secret Act, because that is a very clear instance where we define, okay, what is this information? What is this right? How do you misappropriate it? What does that mean to misappropriate that? And then what are the causes of action? It's a very, in that way, it's a very clean example of kind of setting up what that private right of action looks like and what the circumstances where you're allowed to seek, injunctive relief or damages. And so I again, this is just how my brain's working. I'm sorry if I'm confusing people, but to me, I think we need to scale this back to, okay, what is the exact sort of circumstance that we want this to apply for now? I agree with the comments. We can always build this out to apply to other types of conduct, but let's figure out what exact right we're trying to protect right now, what exact remedy we're trying to create, and figure out what that language is, and then go from there, because to just define the remedy is going to be somewhat difficult to do in a vacuum as well. Sorry, that did not make much sense, but I'm struggling to verbalize exactly what I think about it.
No worries. Thank you, Mr. Kaufman. It's a challenging space really to get this right, obviously, and other states have not done this much work on it to figure out what the right is. And Mr. Kaufman, one thing I would, I guess, ask is if you struck on page 3, the Romanet 2, it has with the intent to mislead others about the appearance, and you took out that intent provision where that is challenging to assess, but you still have the reasonable person standard. Does that make it better or worse in your view?
Well, that's a great question, Mr. Chairman, and that's kind of what I was getting at before with the per se comments. I mean, again, under the Trade Secret Act as an example, either it happens or it doesn't, right? So from a campaign standpoint, are we saying that it's okay to use generative AI content about somebody else as long as it's not intended to be misleading, or as long as it's, right, in our minds, not a bad thing? Or is just the fact that you're using someone else's image to portray a message that they didn't say, is that in and of itself, right, a violation? And that's where I personally am getting a little bit hung up on this language, because I think we're just leaving a whole bunch of arguments on the table for people to say, well, the intent wasn't to mislead, the intent was to, I'm a huge Senator Rothfuss fan, so I took a whole bunch of video of him saying different things and I put together a video and I put it out there. Well, you might not like that, right? And you might not approve of it, even if I think it's a good thing. So are we just are we wanting to create the standard that if you do this, there could be a cause of action in and of itself, separate and apart from intent? Or is the intent to mislead, or is the intent to do harm the source of the cause of action? Because to me, that's just a very, very different analysis for those two.
Now, that makes good sense. I think, honestly, you've convinced me that removing Romanet 2 is probably a good thing as this is drafted. That doesn't mean the rest of it works, but I can see that at least it creates a clearer circumstance at that point where either somebody was misled or not misled, and that then becomes the standard, and you've got the reasonable person standard as to whether the material is something that they would consider to be naturally occurring or not. So would a reasonable person think this happened as a result of the video? That at least it takes away one of the arbitrary or subjective, I guess we'll say, not arbitrary, but subjective standards that's in place. That makes sense. And I guess I don't know exactly what it would hurt at that point with the material that's there. Other thoughts before we go to public comment? Mr. Hopkinson.
Mr. Chairman, just to briefly address that on the paragraph 2 on page 3, I think the reason that was originally put in there was to protect those who might disseminate the media not knowing that it was fake. And so that's why the committee originally, I think, put in that intent to mislead element, because without it, not that we couldn't change other portions of the bill to account for this, but I think if you remove that, then you might capture some people who are disseminating the media thinking it might be true. And the committee at that time didn't want to inadvertently punish people who didn't realize that what they were disseminating was
Well,
synthetic media.
I think we have that covered on page 2 in the paragraph B, where a person engages in unlawful dissemination of misleading synthetic media under this article when he knowingly and intentionally disseminates synthetic media, knowing it to be synthetic media. So you have to establish that they know it's synthetic media and that they've knowingly and intentionally disseminated it. But you don't have to meet the intent to mislead. I think it's as Mr. Kaufman says at that point, if they meet the I knew it was fake and I've intentionally disseminated fake information, then I have misled at that point. You don't need the intent to mislead, and you can take that away. I think that's what Mr. Kaufman's getting at there. And I think it still meets that intent standard from the I have to know that it was a fake. I can't, it is fully harmless if I've disseminated it and I didn't know that it was fake. I'm just one of those reasonable people that thought it was real. Mr. Kaufman, is that accurate? How you see it?
Yeah, I think that's a fair characterization, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. All right, anything else before we go to public comments? All right, seeing none, let's start with public comment in the room. And for those just joining, we're talking about Senate File 51, unlawful dissemination of misleading synthetic media. It is available on the web. Hello, good to see you. Please introduce yourself once again to the committee. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Travis McNevin here on behalf of Google. I will be brief, both with the time of day and with others that may be online. To be honest, Mr. Chairman, I'm not quite exactly sure I understand maybe what direction this is going at this point in large or small chunks or whatnot. So I will tailor a couple of just thoughts back to just some of the fundamentals of what Google's thoughts were on this. Certainly appreciate the committee's willingness to tackle what is hard to, kind of get your arms around, and I think that's been kind of borne out by the discussion here so far. Very little bit of background that is maybe just for the committee's information with respect to voluntary AI labeling. Google was the first company to introduce technology that watermarks its AI generated content. And to Representative Singh's point earlier, was also the first to require political advertisers to disclose when they are using artificial intelligence to contribute to their ads. And so that element of voluntary labeling as far as voluntary practices and regulations within Google and the platforms is advancing and growing as far as that goes. As the committee considers, S51 or something similar, it is Google's recommendation, and I certainly understand where you stand on that, Mr. Chairman, is that either creators or advertisers or sponsors of the content be the ones to be required to disclose that to the consumers. In any scenario where content is synthetically generated and distributed, only the creator, the advertiser, or the sponsor is in a position to know with certainty what content they have put, what content they have posted is misleading, and particularly intentionally so. Additionally, just for the committee's benefit, a number of states have passed legislation similar-ish to 51, most in the political space, but nevertheless, 8 states that I was a shared background with, 3 of them which are our immediate neighbors. And one of the things that they do, and would be a request from Google to create a certain amount of similarity, is that in these bills, Utah, Idaho, Wisconsin, Mississippi, Alabama, others have approved laws that include language that either require the content creators or sponsors or advertisers to make the relevant disclosures, or they have 47 USC 230 exemptions or both. And so one or the other or both has been, to at least to date, fairly common practice in some other states as they tackle bills in this space. I think with that, I'll certainly take some questions if I can answer them, and or go get the information for you and bring it back at a future date.
Great, and thank you for your testimony. We appreciate it. Questions for Mr. McNiven? Go ahead, Representative Singh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if you were here earlier for the conversation about decentralized language models. I was just wondering if Google had a position on that.
Go ahead, Mr. McNiven.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Singh, I'm sorry, I was not. I'd be happy to, ask if, ask more specifically or visit with you afterwards and try to get you an answer. But short answer, no, I'm personally not familiar with right off the cuff.
Great. Any follow-up?
No problem. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Great. Additional questions? So I'll follow up with a couple, and we've had these discussions before last year, and I understand why Google would be interested in basically being pushed outside of the responsibility window, which is effectively the ask. I would always request that too if I were a large industry that did this. But from a practical standpoint, what the other states have done where the disseminators of the potential misinformation have removed themselves from the responsibility, it seems to allow them to continue to benefit from the viral nature of the content. So benefit from the content, which is in their financial interest, and it's also in the interest of the creator. When in circumstances where there's an advertisement and the creator, the path seems to work. It makes good sense. You've got a little trail. You can say, all right, it's your fault. Take it down. How do we handle the circumstance where we don't know the creator and it's not an ad? It is the viral content. It's been intentionally injected to mislead. Let's say it's watermarked. Google is watermarking theirs. Let's say it's just straight up obviously fabricated. It's fabricated, but it's being propagated. It's got 1 million hits. It's the greatest video ever made. Totally misleading. Is it Google's suggestion that you have no obligation to set the public straight, to provide any information, and that the state of Wyoming should just say, well, sorry, there's nothing that can be done to our citizens?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that question. It's my understanding that the goal of this bill currently as drafted is to get the label, the watermark, the stamp, whatever,
Sure.
Whatever you want to call that, just so that people are aware of accuracy, I guess, is this synthetically generated in some form or another? And my understanding, again, and that's the goal, so that people can have that, whether that video is the greatest hit or not, is to a certain extent irrelevant if the goal is to make sure if it's just to be properly labeled. I certainly feel like, with the voluntary nature of some of the steps that's already being done, and Google, I do not believe is the only one taking those sort of steps to get things watermarked or labeled, that goal in industry and having best practices as this continues to move forward or roll forward is taking place. I'm not sure that, does that, maybe I didn't quite understand or
No, I
grasp
mean, I think that gets
question.
at it, but the challenge is always, good actors doing good things are not really who we're typically worried about. We don't write laws regret for the folks that are doing things the right way. I can think of some social media companies that are probably not going to put up warnings. There are some prominent ones that I would be truly shocked if they just rolled out and said, wow, this is a deep fake, and really did their best evidence or effort to ensure that. And maybe that'll prove to be wrong, but those social media platforms have some social responsibility. Do you agree?
I believe that there is certainly social responsibility, and I further believe that that is the direction that the 47 US Code 230 and what is and isn't, falling in that. And my understanding is at least that's where states are giving, a nod to that that law.
Right,
That with those exemptions.
Sure, you've got the federal law, but you've heard a lot of the examples we've talked about, and I don't think any of these examples that we've talked about run afoul of any law. I mean, I think we can do an awful lot that is perfectly legal, but still intentionally misleads people very effectively. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I mean, I think there's a lot of
So if
misleading that goes on.
if our objective is to protect Wyoming citizens, to ensure that if they are receiving fake videos, that they know they're fake videos, is that not a reasonable public interest for the state, for our legislature on behalf of the people of Wyoming? That seems like it's more of our responsibility than Google's, quite honestly, in terms of protecting the interest. Google's a company that has the intent to maximize profit for shareholders, right? It's a C corp. That's the model of Alphabet and the daughter companies. The role of the Wyoming legislature is to try to find ways to protect its citizens, and in this case, from misinformation, and to try and create a regulatory structure that ensures that if they're being misinformed, they have some sort of a right, or they know about it. So I guess I'm failing to understand how large industry telling us to just trust us and wait because there is a federal law that we know doesn't actually address this is going to be sufficient. I'm missing why we shouldn't take action.
Mr. Chairman, I do not believe my, as I said before you, the ask or the suggestion is to not take action. I think my understanding, again, my testimony would be that with the bill as written today, the only change, tweak, ask, modification, whatever you will, is on behalf of Google, that it would be that the creators, again, and I know your position, and or recognizing the 230 exclusion be included in the bill. Everything else, is a matter of policy, as you very well articulated, with the bill.
On the creator side, though, I guess I just don't understand what the response is to the argument that when it's a bad actor, it'll be very unlikely that we will know the creator, and that we still need a remedy for that. And we've gone back and forth on this, and this is what I guess I would like to understand is how is that protecting the interest of the people of Wyoming? I see where it's protecting Google's interest, but I do not see where changing the legislation, as you just suggested, helps the people of Wyoming. So do you have any further thoughts on that?
I will.
Okay.
I wouldn't know how to respond to that other than to say, that is.
Well, I guess I'll, ask back. Let's try and explore that one more and get an answer of how the people of Wyoming are better off with that exemption in place.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, absolutely. Further questions? And I appreciate the conversation, appreciate the hard work that you've put in on this, and we'll keep engaging on it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much.
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
thank you. One last question. Well, really two questions for you. Is it possible right now on social media to for users to flag information that they suspect is false information, and does flagging that post, if it's possible, if the fear is something going viral that's false, does flagging that post change how it is affected in the algorithm to stop it from being spread to the public?
Mr. McNiven, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Representative Singh. The question that I would have in that is what's false? I don't know how to respond really to that. For example, in a policy, we'll use politics, for example. Governor, Smith of some state, vetoes some bill that has funding through K through 12, and a response on any social media platform says, Governor Smith has ended, K through 12 funding as we know it. Those types of statements happen quite frequently, right? All the time. Has it ended K through 12, and then will there never be K through 12 schools again? No, that would be false. Is that an exaggeration? Is that a sort of thing? And then there's a certain amount of, just speech to that. I think I could go back and, try and ask, the process, the steps, if somebody thought something was generated, via, artificial intelligence to the point of this bill, and say, is there steps that, or you could flag if you believe, this has been artificially generated, not whether right, wrong, false or not, just I believe this may be AI, material that needs a label, and, could you flag it for that? And I'd be happy to ask if or how that would work if you would like.
Great. Any follow-up?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for letting us know that. I just shared that to try to alleviate that question. So thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate your testimony.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Anything further? All right, seeing none, thank you. Any further public testimony in the room? In the room, seeing none. Any public testimony online? Oh, excellent. That gets us out of here in time. Seeing no public testimony is closed. Back to the committee. All right, committee, what's your pleasure? What do we want to do for the next meeting with regard to this legislation? We've got a lot of suggestions. Does anyone have any desire on how we would want to proceed? Which could start with drafting this bill, drafting different bills, doing nothing, talking about it longer. We've got all these options. Anyone want to throw out an idea? Mr. Co-Chairman, thoughts?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. Yeah, I know a lot of the members, actual legislative members of the select committee, I think with Senator Ellis and some other folks are not here. I mean, maybe it's beneficial if we just delay this till further to the next meeting until we can get full participation and support. Because I think just given the nature of this bill and the topic it represents, it would just yield a better product if we could get the full committee. Mr. Co-Chairman, what would your thoughts be on that?
I think that's fair. And I think we can also explore, there have been quite a few bills out there. We can take a look at those bills. I really haven't seen any of them, again, that do things well. I think they really are just we needed a bill. We copied this other bill. The bill has huge loopholes, but we can certainly explore what other legislation is out there. We can talk through the idea of what it would look like if we broke this into smaller pieces, what it would look like as an election bill, and then just kind of try and prepare maybe some alternatives or some concepts to discuss for next time. Thoughts? Anyone want to weigh in on those directions or offer some other suggestion? Anyone online? Without any further comment, I think we'll just go that route. We'll keep it on the agenda for next time. We're definitely going to be talking about artificial intelligence next time. So we can try and explore alternatives in this space and see if any other ideas come up for next time. That would give us a relatively short fuse on drafting legislation, because if we didn't have legislation drafted for next, then we would have to draft it for the final meeting, and we'd have to act relatively quickly on a complex bill, but we can probably pull that off. All right, everyone comfortable with that? All right, seeing no objection, we will proceed that way. We'll try and explore more options for next time in this space and look at the bills that other states have gone to see if we can get any ideas out of them on ways that we might be able to narrow this down and be effective. All right. Thanks, committee. That's a challenging topic. I think it's an important one. I think we're going to find out really how important it is during the fall. We'll learn something. All right, and with that, let's do general public comment first, just to see if there is any. I don't know that there is any general public comment on topics that we haven't had in committee, in the room. Seeing none. Anything online? General public comment? No. Okay. Then we are back to some committee actions. I know we didn't take action earlier today on a couple of things that we were talking about. Let me go back to those. So we had a couple of things. One is discussion back with the Secretary of State's office about the corporate filing system, how we want to proceed there, and how we want to proceed with House Bill 79, which is the Secretary of State expedited filings. Maybe we can knock that one out real quickly. Mr. Co-Chairman, I'm inclined to just get that redrafted as is. House Bill 79 was in good shape. I'm still not compelled that we need additional positions through that bill, even though I support it through the budget process. Are you comfortable with that approach?
Mr. Co-Chairman, yes, I am.
All right. Committee, is everyone comfortable with that? We're just getting it drafted for next time for consideration. So without objection, let's do that. Any objection? Seeing none. So let's have House Bill 79 redrafted so that we're ready to go with it. We'll consider it next time as drafted. It's in good shape. On the corporate filing systems update, which associates with digital identity, digital asset lien registry, Mr. Co-Chairman, what are your thoughts? What do we want to have requested? We can decide tomorrow too, but if we've got any ideas to close up today, that would be great.
It just, Mr. Co-Chairman, it seems that I think we have identified, potential benefits, but I sense that isn't a lot of consensus about the precise options in terms of the lien registry. I mean, obviously, I think at the end of the day, we have to be super careful that we're not going in and amending UCC or any of those procedures that have been on the books for a long time, and that our entire, business ecosystem has adapt themselves to and accepted as standards and norms. We can also continue that for further discussion next time, but I don't know if there's a clear path forward. I don't know. Obviously, Mr. Revelle, he was really passionate about this. Perhaps he's got some
Joel, what do you think we should do?
incisive comments.
If you've got any ideas.
I do think that there is going to be a significant opportunity for the registration of digital assets and registrations of liens. The challenges that face the Secretary of State's office right now to try and make that happen are the exact sorts of challenges that the blockchain was intended to solve. And so it's a little bit of a chicken and egg issue here. I think if we had the ability to register digital assets through APIs or even more ideally on a blockchain, a lot of the issues that we're facing today would be resolved, and the whole UCC process would be overhauled in a very positive way.
Agreed.
So that all notwithstanding, there are certainly challenges to getting that done. I do think that it is a enormous global capital markets opportunity, and there is no one that I'm aware of proposing to do it, and Wyoming could very easily fill that void. But I can't sit here today and say that it's going to generate a good ROI on appropriations in the next 12 months. I just, I have no way of knowing that.
Anyone else have any thoughts at this point? So, my read of it based on what the Secretary of State was suggesting, as well as what we've been hearing over the last few years, the Secretary of State put in an appropriation request to upgrade their entire system and do a revamp. I think it was around $2 million. That was denied, but they know that they need to revamp their entire corporate filing system. We've been looking for that revamp for 7 years, I think, and looking for it in a way that establishes digital identity, corporate identity, cryptographic signatures, all of the things that we start building an ecosystem, and then we can tack on an improved digital asset registry. We can tack on lien filing. All of these things then become relatively simple pieces that are added on to a core, which is a blockchain-based digital identity system, effectively, where that includes corporate filing and everything else we need. So we know what we need. It's a struggle for the Secretary of State's office, but I think we could try things a little bit differently and use the Blockchain Center at the University of Wyoming to do the heavy lifting and development and partner with the Secretary of State's office. And we could try that path and see how it works. We know that they're already engaging in partnerships right now to build some property work. And that seems like another puzzle piece that can go into this. So maybe the right answer is to put together some legislation a little different from what we did in the past, where now we appropriate a couple $1 million of the Secretary of State's hard-earned funds, where they increased that by $8 million last year. Good job. I think a lot of that was from work that this committee and the Minerals Committee has done in recent years to improve our corporate structure, our banking structure, our trust structure in the state. Take a couple of $1 million, appropriate that to University of Wyoming Blockchain Center, have them work in partnership with the Secretary of State's office and build this whole thing. And then don't have that a one-off RFP process, have that an ongoing, we build this piece, we build this piece, we work in tandem, beta test, do it the right way. But I think we have more flexibility if it's a partnership between the Secretary of State's office and the university. What does everyone think of that approach? And we can talk about that. We can get a bill drafted that basically says, we're going to do this. Here's $2 million to do it. The $2 million goes to the university, and we build this system. Thoughts on that approach? We can get that drafted and talk about it. Mr. Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. Just for clarification, is the idea to just direct the usage of SR funds within the Secretary's office? Is that?
Well, so we've done that both ways, right? The Appropriations Committee hates it when we just use the SR funds. They want all the SR funds to go to the general fund, and they want us to appropriate from the general fund. So that's the appropriations tilt. If we want to get it through appropriations, that'll make them happier. On the other hand, probably everyone else in the legislature would like it to come out of SR funds instead of the general fund, because then it doesn't look like spending, then it looks like new money coming in and new revenue. So I guess we just pick our battle. You can have it either way. We can say it's general fund, and then we can point to the $8.5 million increase. It's substantial money, right? They're bringing in $50 million a year, and they've increased it by $8.5 million. This is a small portion of the year-over-year increase. And we know that the only state that has more registrants than we do gets $1.3 billion of revenue a year. That's non-trivial.
Yeah, Mr. Co-Chairman, I think I'm personally very comfortable with them using SR funds, right? I mean, it's not like this is general fund appropriations that we give it to them, and then we're going back in and amending the language they have to spend, or how they can spend that rather. So I see no problem with that. Just kind of saying, hey, out of the SR funds you generate, it's going to be spent this way. And I think so long as it adheres to just all the standard practices of, RFP, open bidding, all that jazz.
The beauty is we wouldn't need to use the RFP process if we go to the university. Not that the university is exempt from the RFP process, but if we make this a project where it's led out of the University Center for Blockchain, then there's a process being led that still does have competitive outsourcing and partnerships and bidding, but the university through the center is going to be more flexible and be able to just pull people in, bring in faculty. You have an ecosystem, and you can get partners that are external, and you can still do procurement, where the Secretary of State's office has one tool, and that is RFP. And then once the RFP closes, as we talked about, you're done. Your process, your project is done, and you need a new RFP, you need a new appropriation to do upgrades. This is one of those projects that should probably go on for 3 to 5 years. You just keep building it, and an RFP doesn't seem like the appropriate tool. A project with a headquarters of some unit that's going to continue for several years seems like a better approach.
Mr. Co-Chair, I agree. I just meant it's probably reasonable to assume that they're going to have to go to some outside third-party vendor in some instances, and so long as it follows the procurement process in those instances. I
Yeah,
see no problem with that.
if the university, right, exactly. If there is an external requirement, then the university has to follow state procurement as well and has their own internal processes, and it's handled similar. Go ahead, Mr. Revel.
I don't have a good educated view as to whether this is best placed in the public sector, i.e. UW, or through an RFP process in the private sector. But I do think that it would be critically important that there is UCC sort of legal expertise that is part of at least the original design. And that could be done through the law school, or it could be done through, some of our private sector legal experts that have been helpful in the past. Just add that to the mix.
Yeah, that's a good point. And we've obviously had good partnerships with some stakeholders that have been a part of our committee work over the years. We could bring them in. We could contemplate an advisory committee for if we put together an entity, it could have an advisory committee where we bring in some experts. I don't know whether that's a positive or not, but that's something for us to contemplate. But just again, trying to get this going again, and we tried to create a system before where we gave money to the Secretary of State's office to get this done. It never got done. I feel like we just need to do something, and instead of talk about it more and having a bill as a vehicle, as well as an institution that I think would be very receptive to getting that work done in partnership with the Secretary of State's office would be potentially good. Other thoughts?
Yeah, Mr. Co-Chairman.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think at the core of it, we just have to come back to making sure we're not going in and tinkering with, with the UCC process. But yeah, absolutely. And there's plenty of folks we can pull in to make sure that we're not going in and twisting any knobs where we probably should be. So yeah, I'm all for it.
All right. Other thoughts? Online, Mr. Kaufman, Mr. Pope, what are your thoughts? Mr. Kaufman, you good with it?
Yeah, I'm good with it, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Good. Mr. Pope?
I'm good with it as well. Thank you.
All right. So then without objection, let's get a bill drafted to take a look at that does that, directs $2 million appropriation to the University of Wyoming Center for Blockchain and Innovation, and directs that those dollars only be expended towards development of, and then we can include a lot of the language we had before, which is an API-driven, blockchain-based corporate filing system, and build out components to potentially include digital asset registration, digital asset lien registration, and digital identity registration, et cetera. So a good little list of things that could be covered under that project. I don't know what the right order of build is going to be. You need some core API that has digital identity integrated with blockchain at its core, and then building out from there. The order of operations, I'm not sure. So make sure that we have flexibility, but and then in consultation and partnership with the Secretary of State's office. I think that'll do it. Doesn't need to be ridiculously long. Oh, as far as the source, did we decide we want to do special revenue, or do we want to do? Do you want to do that first,
Mr. Co-Chair, might as well. I mean, they've got the money.
All right.
So.
Let's appropriate that $2 million out of their special revenue, and that'll give the Appropriations Committee something to complain about. Mr. Hopkinson.
Did you want As far as that appropriation, a typical would be for the fiscal year, et cetera. Did you want that to extend beyond that, or what's your timeline that you're looking at with this?
Yeah, it needs to shall not revert for a while, because there's no way this project will get done in 1 year.
Mr. Chairman, definitely put for a while in the bill.
For a while.
Yeah.
So we put that, it'll last for a while. Shall not revert for a while. That's good legislating. We can throw in an arbitrary date of 27 or something along those lines, just to structure it so that we can talk about it. Try to expend it by that time. And shall not revert. A lot of times appropriations to the university are deemed as appropriations, and unless an account is set up that they're drawing from, typically those appropriations to the university aren't going to revert. I guess we can look into that. So it would be appropriation from special revenue to the university's blockchain center for the purpose of, yeah, you don't actually probably need reversion language or expiration language, because I think when we do that, that's almost final, and there's no expectation of reversion. It's a one-time.
It is a one-time, but if they only ended up spending $1 million, what are they doing with the rest? That's my only concern.
Fair,
with not
okay.
having reversion.
Let's put in a reversion date then of 27, and we'll talk more about that. Yeah. Yep. Sorry. Go ahead, Mr. Land. Come on up. We haven't heard from you in
this is only in my
couple of
personal
hours.
capacity, and this is not,
Yeah.
reflective of the views of Senator Lummis. You should take a look at the Delaware blockchain initiative and what they did and kind of the process they went through. I suspect it would cost significantly more than $2 million. I can put you in touch with the Delaware folks. They worked on the UCC filing system back in the day. I think it would be very helpful to learn from them, like where the money went, like what the problems were, how far they got, and stuff like that.
Great. And we did bring them in at one point. We brought in the folks that did the work on their behalf, I guess I'll say. And I guess it depends on how it's done and how it's worked, whether it's internal or external partnership. But yeah, that might be a starting point. That was the dollar value that the Secretary of State's office asked for to upgrade the system. And we'll have to talk about that next time to see what the real value might want to be. Yeah. All right. Thank you, Mr. Land. Anything further on that topic? Seeing none, I think we've got some concept direction there. Was there anything else that we needed to take action on before we adjourn for the day? We talked about we had the 4 concepts. I think, Mr. Co-Chairman, we carry those 3 ideas over to next time, and we look for some speakers on each of them and see what we can develop in conversation for it. But I don't know if we have any bill draft needs for any of those. Do we want any bill drafts? Does anyone have any bill draft ideas for those? Oh, I see Mr. Pope's hand up. Mr. Pope, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one comment. Mr. Marr had a suggestion for possible changes to the commercial registered agent statutes, as well as the notary statutes. And I would like to explore those more if the committee is friendly to that idea, because I think that those could be beneficial.
Good point. And I think I would anticipate that's probably a short bill draft that we could work through quickly. If it's not, then maybe we don't end up having it drafted for next time. But I think drafting some minor tweaks, putting together a little working group, getting folks like Mr. Kaufman and Mr. Marr, who's interested in Mr. Pope, together to work through that a little bit and figure out how we can modernize through tweaks our existing Registered Agent Act to more appropriately reflect the world we live in now is appropriate. Can I get a motion then maybe on that bill draft?
So moved.
All right, Representative Yin, we've got a second. So we've got a motion for a bill draft. And we'll put together a little working group to work out the details on that, work with Mr. Hopkinson on it. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor, say aye. Any opposed? Seeing none. All right, so we'll get that bill draft drafted and circulate that a little bit, figure out what tweaks, modernize the registered agent to more appropriately reflect what's needed in potentially Duna space or at least digital asset and Web3 space, and investigate that a little bit. So a lot of flexibility. We'll see how that goes, and hopefully it's a series of short tweaks. Okay. Anything else we need for next time? Anything else? Going once, going twice, gone. All right. Final comments. All right. Meeting adjourned for the day. See you all here tomorrow at 8:30.